My family laughed in my face when the high-priced corporate lawyer handed me the keys to a rusted 1993 Chevy Silverado. They called the truck a piece of junk. They called me a pathetic loser who deserved absolutely nothing. My younger stepbrother walked away with an $85 million commercial real estate empire, and my stepmother took the $4 million suburban estate and a massive stock portfolio. They demanded I sign the old truck over to a scrapyard right then and there. But I refused, and when I finally broke open the jammed glove box of that beat-up truck, a hidden letter revealed exactly why they wanted it destroyed so badly, and the dark truth about what really happened to my father. The rain was slamming against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the 40th floor boardroom in downtown Chicago. I sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table wearing my dark blue city paramedic uniform. I had just come off a brutal 14-hour shift. My back ached. My hands were calloused and scrubbed raw with industrial soap, and I was running on nothing but cheap precinct coffee. The air conditioning in the legal office was freezing, but I could feel the heat of humiliation already starting to burn in my chest. Across from me sat my stepmother, Cynthia. She was dressed in black designer silk, wearing a pair of dark sunglasses indoors like she was attending a celebrity funeral rather than a private legal reading. Next to her was her biological son, my younger half-brother Bradley. Bradley was 32 years old, 6 years younger than me, but he carried himself like he owned the entire skyline behind the glass. He wore a custom-tailored Brioni suit that cost more than I made in 3 months on an ambulance. He was casually checking his expensive watch, acting as if this reading was just a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. The lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He opened the thick leather-bound folder on the table. My father, Richard, had built sterling commercial real estate from a single rented office into a titan of the Midwest property market. For 30 years, my father was a force of nature. But after my mother passed away when I was a kid, Cynthia moved in and the walls went up. Bradley was born, and from that moment on, I became a ghost in my own family. I chose to save lives on the streets of Chicago. Bradley chose to shadow my father in the boardroom, learning every ruthless tactic available to corporate executives. I did not expect equal shares today. I knew my place in this family. I just wanted something to remember the man I used to know before the money changed him. Mr. Caldwell began to read. He spoke with a cold, mechanical precision that made the room feel even more suffocating. To my wife, Cynthia, I leave the primary residence in Oak Brook fully paid, along with the entirety of the domestic investment portfolio held at Vanguard, and a lump sum cash distribution of $2 million. Cynthia reached up and dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue. She did not say a word. She just nodded, accepting millions of dollars as if it were a simple grocery delivery. Mr. Caldwell turned the page. The silence in the room grew heavier. To my youngest son, Bradley, I leave the entirety of sterling commercial real estate. This includes all operational assets, all subsidiary holding companies, the executive board seat, and complete voting control. The total valuation of these corporate assets is estimated at $85 million. Bradley leaned back in his leather chair and smiled. He actually smiled. There was no grief in his eyes. There was only triumph. He looked over at me, his gaze dripping with absolute superiority. He had won the game. He had secured the crown. I kept my hands folded on the table. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I forced my face to remain completely neutral. I was used to being the forgotten son. I was used to the subtle insults at Thanksgiving dinners, the complete exclusion from family vacations, the way my father would look right through me when I talked about my work as a paramedic. I braced myself for my portion of the reading. I figured there might be a small cash trust, maybe enough to pay off the suffocating debt my wife Caroline and I had accumulated over the last few years. We were drowning in mortgage payments and credit card bills. A few $1,000s would have been a lifeline. Mr. Caldwell stopped reading. He looked up from the leather folder. He looked directly at me, and for a brief second I saw a flicker of genuine pity in his eyes. That was when I knew it was going to be bad. And to my oldest son, Harrison, Mr. Caldwell read slowly. I leave the 1993 Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck currently parked in the long-term storage facility at O'Hare. The room went completely silent. I waited for the rest of the sentence. I waited for Mr. Caldwell to read about a trust fund or a small property or even a modest savings account. But the lawyer just closed the folder. That was it. That was the entire inheritance. Bradley let out a sharp, sudden laugh. The sound echoed off the glass walls. He did not even try to hide his amusement. "Are you serious?" Bradley asked, looking at the lawyer with a massive grin. "A rusty piece of junk from 30 years ago." Mr. Caldwell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single tarnished set of keys attached to a faded leather keychain. He slid them across the long mahogany table. The metal scraped against the polished wood. The keys stopped right in front of me. I stared at them. I recognized that leather keychain. It was the truck my father used to take me fishing in when I was 10 years old, before Cynthia, before the money, before the corporate empire took over his soul. It had been sitting in a storage lot, rotting for over a decade. It was practically worthless. The Kelly Blue Book value was probably less than $1,000, assuming the engine even turned over. A rusted-out truck for a glorified ambulance driver, Bradley mocked, shaking his head. He buttoned his expensive suit jacket and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Dad always knew your level, Harry. You spend your life scraping people off the pavement for pennies. He knew you would not know what to do with real money if he handed it to you. Try not to leak oil on the country club driveway on your way out." My jaw tightened. The disrespect was intentional. It was designed to break me down in front of the lawyer. Cynthia simply crossed her legs and adjusted her sunglasses. Harrison chose a blue-collar life. Cynthia said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Your father felt it was best not to burden him with the complexities of managing a corporate empire. A simple truck for a simple man. It is quite poetic, really." The anger flared in my chest, hot and sharp. I thought about the 14-hour shifts. I thought about the blood on my uniform, the lives I had pulled back from the brink of death, the physical toll my job took on my body every single day. I lived a life of actual consequence. Bradley pushed paper and manipulated tax codes. Yet here they were treating me like a peasant who had wandered into their castle. I reached out and picked up the keys. The metal was cold. I gripped them tightly in my fist, deciding right then and there that I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I would not yell. I would not argue. I would take the final piece of my father that existed before the corruption, and I would walk away with my dignity intact. "I guess we are done here," I said quietly, pushing my chair back to stand up. "Wait," Mr. Caldwell said hastily. He pulled a single sheet of paper from a secondary file. "There is one administrative matter regarding the vehicle." Bradley waved his hand dismissively. "Do not worry about the storage fees, Harry. I am feeling generous today. Since you cannot possibly afford the back fees on that storage unit on a paramedic's salary, I had my legal team draft a waiver." Bradley slid a sleek silver pen and the document across the table toward me. "Sign this," Bradley ordered. His tone shifted instantly from mocking to commanding. "It is a title transfer and a scrapyard authorization. I have a towing company on standby. They will go to the lot haul that rusted piece of garbage to the crusher, and I will cover the disposal fees. You will not have to pay a dime." I looked down at the paper. It was a legally binding transfer of ownership directly to a salvage company owned by one of Bradley's subsidiaries. "Why would you care about scrapping a 30-year-old truck?" I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. "It is a liability." Bradley snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. His casual, arrogant posture stiffened. "The truck has been sitting idle for years. It is an environmental hazard. The storage lot is owned by our company, and I am liquidating that property next month. I want that junk completely crushed and destroyed by the end of the day. Sign the paper, Harry. Take the favor." I looked at Bradley. I noticed a tiny bead of sweat forming near his hairline. I looked at Cynthia. She was sitting completely rigid, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles were turning white. They were nervous. For the last 20 minutes, they had been gloating over $85 million. But right now, in this exact moment, all of their focus, all of their intense anxiety was directed entirely at a worthless 1993 Chevy Silverado. Something was wrong. The paramedic instincts in my brain, the instincts honed by years of reading microscopic changes in a patient's physical behavior, started screaming at me. Bradley was pushing too hard. He was too eager to destroy a truck he claimed was garbage. "I am keeping it," I said. Bradley stood up from his chair. His face flushed bright red. "You do not have the money to restore it, you idiot. It does not run. It is a piece of trash. Sign the document." "No," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. I slipped the tarnished keys into my pocket. My father left it to me. It is my property now. If it needs to be towed, I will tow it myself. "Harry, do not be stubborn and stupid," Cynthia hissed, pulling her sunglasses down slightly to glare at me with absolute venom. "Bradley is trying to help you. You are creating an unnecessary mess." "I am keeping the truck," I repeated. I stepped away from the table and turned my back on them. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air pressure had dropped. I could hear Bradley breathing heavily behind me. "You drive that rolling tetanus trap off my property by tonight," Bradley shouted as I reached the heavy glass doors. "If it is still in the storage lot tomorrow morning, I will have it impounded and crushed myself. Do you understand me?" I did not answer him. I pushed through the glass doors and walked out into the carpeted hallway, leaving them sitting in their millions. I walked toward the elevators, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had just been legally disinherited. I had been openly mocked and treated like absolute dirt by the people who were supposed to be my family. I had lost out on millions of dollars that could have changed the trajectory of my entire life. But as the elevator doors closed, shutting out the luxurious lobby of the legal firm, my fingers traced the jagged edges of the old brass keys in my pocket. Bradley was hiding something. I knew it in my bones. A man who just inherited $85 million does not lose his temper over a scrapyard waiver unless that piece of scrap threatens his empire. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the freezing Chicago rain. I did not have an umbrella. The cold water soaked through my uniform shirt instantly, but I barely felt it. I walked 3 blocks to a cheap parking garage and got into my beat-up 10-year-old sedan. The engine sputtered before finally catching. The dashboard illuminated, showing the check engine light glaring back at me. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. My financial life was a disaster. Caroline, my wife, had been heavily counting on this will reading. We had been fighting for 6 months about money. She had maxed out 2 credit cards trying to maintain a lifestyle we absolutely could not afford, claiming she was stressed and needed retail therapy. I had been working extra shifts just to cover the minimum payments. Caroline was convinced my father would leave me at least $1 million. She had already been browsing real estate listings in the upscale suburbs. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged into the heavy city traffic. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Caroline. "How much did we get?" "Call me right now." I did not call her. I could not find the words. How could I tell the woman I had been married to for 10 years that my father valued my existence so little that he left me a broken-down truck? How could I explain the profound rejection I had just experienced? I drove for an hour navigating the slick, rain-soaked highways out to the suburbs. I needed comfort. I needed my wife to look at me, tell me that the money did not matter, and remind me that we would survive this together, just like we always did. I pulled into the driveway of our modest siding-damaged house. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet car for a long moment, listening to the rain hit the roof. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I gathered my empty lunch bag and my wet jacket, stepped out of the car, and walked up to the front door. I put my key in the lock and turned it. I expected to walk into the smell of dinner or maybe the sound of the television. Instead, I opened the door and walked directly into an ambush that would completely destroy the last remaining pillar of my life. The rain was coming down harder by the time I turned onto my street. The rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers was the only sound inside my old sedan. I was shivering in my damp paramedic uniform. Every muscle in my body ached from the 14-hour shift, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the heavy crushing weight in my chest. I had just been handed a 30-year-old rusted truck while my younger half-brother walked away with an $85 million real estate empire. I felt hollow. I felt like a ghost. I just wanted to walk through my front door, hold my wife Caroline, and tell her everything was going to be all right. We had been married for 10 years. We had built a modest, quiet life in this small suburban house. It was not a mansion. The vinyl siding was peeling near the garage, and the roof needed replacing, but it was ours. Or at least that was what I thought. I parked in the driveway and turned off the engine. The check engine light finally blinked out. I sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the rain drumming against the roof of the car. I tried to mentally prepare myself for the conversation. Caroline had been so sure my father would leave me a massive cash trust. She had spent the last 6 months talking about renovations, new cars, and private schools for our 2 young children. I knew the truth was going to disappoint her, but I believed our marriage was stronger than money. I grabbed my empty lunch cooler, stepped out into the freezing November downpour, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, expecting the familiar warmth of the central heating and the smell of whatever she had put in the slow cooker that morning. Instead, the house was completely dark and the air was freezing. The thermostat had been turned off. I stepped into the entryway and froze. Sitting at the bottom of the staircase were 3 large black suitcases. Next to them were 2 stacked cardboard boxes. For a second, my exhausted brain could not process what I was looking at. I thought maybe we were finally doing the winter closet clean-out she had been talking about. Then I looked up and saw Caroline standing in the kitchen doorway. She was fully dressed in her heavy winter coat. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a mask of pure absolute stone. There was no greeting. There was no sympathy in her eyes. There was only a cold, calculating rage that I had never seen before. She held her smartphone in her right hand, the screen still glowing in the dim light of the hallway. I took off my wet boots, confused and suddenly terrified. "Where are the kids?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "They are at my mother's house," Caroline replied. Her voice was flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am taking them there tonight." I stood up straight, letting my wet jacket drip onto the linoleum floor. "What is going on, Caroline?" I asked, gesturing to the suitcases. "Are we going somewhere?" She let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded exactly like the laugh my brother Bradley had let out in the boardroom an hour earlier. "We are not going anywhere, Harrison," she said. "I am leaving, and you are going to pack a bag and get out of this house before I call the police." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. I walked a few steps closer to the kitchen, raising my hands in a calming gesture. "Caroline, please talk to me," I said, pleading with her. I just had the worst day of my life. My father left me practically nothing. Bradley took the entire company. I know, Caroline snapped, cutting me off instantly. "Cynthia texted me 20 minutes ago. She told me exactly what happened in that boardroom. She told me you sat there like a coward and let them hand you a rusted set of keys to a garbage truck while your brother inherited an empire." Caroline took a step toward me, her eyes burning with an intense, furious hatred. I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach. Cynthia had intentionally texted my wife before I could even get home. It was a calculated strike designed to detonate my marriage before I even walked through the door. "Caroline, you know how my father was?" I tried to explain, keeping my voice soft. "You know how Cynthia and Bradley manipulated him at the end. It does not matter. I have a good job. We can survive this." "Survive this!" Caroline screamed, her voice echoing off the empty living room walls. "You think your pathetic paramedic salary is going to save us? You have no idea what is actually happening, Harrison. She reached into her purse, pulled out a thick stack of folded bank statements, and threw them violently at my chest. The papers hit my wet uniform and fluttered to the floor. I looked down at them, recognizing the logos of 3 different premium credit card companies. I picked one up. The balance at the top of the page read $14,000. I grabbed the next one. $16,000. I flipped to the third. $10,000. My heart completely stopped. "What is this, Caroline?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "That is reality, Harrison," she spat back. "I have racked up $40,000 in debt over the last 8 months. I bought clothes, I paid for vacations, I kept up appearances with my friends because I was suffocating in this cheap, pathetic little life you provided. I only maxed those cards out because I thought your father was going to die and leave us millions of dollars. I thought his will would wipe the slate clean and finally give me the life I actually deserve." I stared at the bank statements in my hand, completely paralyzed by the betrayal. She had been secretly spending tens of thousands of dollars behind my back, literally gambling our family's entire financial future on the death of my father. "You lied to me," I said, my voice cracking. "You put our family in massive debt for clothes and vacations." "It was an investment in my sanity," Caroline yelled, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "I wasted 10 of my best years waiting for you to step up and claim your birthright. 10 years of watching you wash blood off your hands for an hourly wage while your brother flew private to Aspen. You are weak, Harrison. You always have been. You let him hand you a pile of scrap metal while Bradley took an empire. You are financially pathetic, Harrison. I am filing for divorce first thing tomorrow morning. I am taking full custody of the kids because a judge is never going to give them to a broke homeless ambulance driver. And my lawyer will ensure you pay the mortgage for this house even though you are no longer living in it. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life paying for my comfort." The sheer cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. This was the woman I had sworn to protect. This was the woman I had worked double shifts for so she could stay home and raise our children. In the span of a single afternoon, my stepbrother had stripped me of my legacy, and my wife had stripped me of my family. I looked around the house we had built together, realizing that every single piece of furniture, every framed photograph on the wall was a complete illusion. "Caroline, you cannot do this," I said, trying desperately to find a shred of logic in the nightmare. "We have $12,000 in our joint savings account. We can use that to hire a financial counselor. We can consolidate the debt. I will work overtime every single weekend. We do not have to destroy our family over money." Caroline smiled. It was a cold, ruthless smile that made my blood run absolutely cold. "We do not have $12,000, Harrison," she said smoothly. "I transferred the entire balance of our joint savings into a private account under my mother's name 3 hours ago. The moment Cynthia texted me about the truck, I called the bank and drained it. You have exactly $38 in your personal checking account. You are completely broke." I felt the air leave my lungs. She had planned this with absolute precision. She had executed a perfect financial strike before I even knew we were at war. "You stole our money," I said, stepping forward. "That money was for the kids' college fund." "It is my money now," Caroline shot back, stepping back toward the front door and resting her hand on the deadbolt. "And if you take one more step toward me, I am going to call 911. I will tell the dispatcher that my estranged husband has become violent and I fear for my life. By the time your precinct captain hears about the domestic disturbance call, you will lose your precious paramedic badge too." I stopped dead in my tracks. I knew she was completely serious. She would ruin my career just to get me out of the house faster. She had weaponized the legal system against me in a matter of minutes. "Get your things," Harrison Caroline commanded, gesturing toward the hall closet. "Take a bag and get out of my house. If you are not gone in exactly 3 minutes, I am making the call." I realized there was absolutely nothing left to fight for in that house. The woman standing in front of me was a complete stranger. I walked past her, keeping my hands entirely visible, and went to the hall closet. I pulled out an old, faded canvas duffel bag. I did not bother going upstairs to the bedroom. I knew she was counting the seconds. I grabbed 3 spare paramedic uniforms from the laundry room, a handful of socks and underwear, and my heavy winter coat. I shoved them all into the duffel bag and zipped it shut. I walked back to the front door. Caroline was holding her phone, her thumb hovering directly over the emergency call button. I looked at her one last time, wanting to say something profound, wanting to make her understand the depth of her betrayal, but I realized that words were completely useless against someone who only valued money. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Caroline slammed the door shut behind me instantly, and I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place with a loud metallic click. I was standing on my own front porch, locked out of my own life. The November rain was coming down in freezing sheets, turning the suburban street into a dark, blurry river. I pulled my heavy coat tightly around my shoulders and walked down the driveway. My old sedan was parked right where I had left it, but I did not have the keys to the house or the spare car key. Caroline had taken them from the counter. I pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked and the battery was at 14%. I opened a ride-sharing app and looked at my linked bank account. I had exactly $38 to my name. I typed in the address for the long-term vehicle storage lot near O'Hare International Airport. The estimated fare was $29. I requested the ride and stood under the dim glow of a broken street lamp, shivering as the freezing rain soaked through my boots. 10 minutes later, a silver hybrid pulled up to the curb. I climbed into the back seat, tossing my wet duffel bag onto the floorboard. The driver did not say a word, which I was incredibly grateful for. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window and watched the city blur past me in the dark. In less than 6 hours, I had lost my father, my inheritance, my marriage, my children, my home, and my life savings. I had been stripped down to absolute zero by the people who were supposed to love me the most. The ride took 45 minutes. The driver finally pulled off the main highway and navigated down a dark, poorly paved industrial road lined with chain-link fences and barbed wire. We stopped in front of a massive, dimly lit impound lot filled with hundreds of forgotten vehicles. I paid the driver, tipped him the last few dollars in my account, and stepped out into the mud. The rain was relentless. I walked up to the rusted pedestrian gate of the storage facility. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers brushed against the tarnished brass keys Mr. Caldwell had handed me in the boardroom. My stepbrother thought he had handed me a useless piece of trash to finalize my humiliation. My wife thought she had destroyed my future because of it. But as I walked through the mud toward the back of the dark lot looking for a 1993 Chevy Silverado, I realized this rusted truck was literally the only thing in the entire world I still owned. It was my absolute rock bottom. I had no idea that breaking open the jammed glove box of that old truck would be the very thing that saved my life. I spent the first night of my new reality shivering in the driver's seat of a 30-year-old truck. The vinyl bench seat was hard and cracked, offering absolutely no comfort for a body that had just endured a 14-hour shift. The November cold seeped through the rusted floorboards of the Chevy Silverado, biting at my ankles and settling deep into my bones. Every time the wind howled across the dark impound lot, the cabin temperature dropped another degree. I pulled my damp winter coat tighter around my chest, but it did nothing to stop the shaking. My breath plumed in the freezing air, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of a distant street lamp shining through the rain-slicked windshield. I did not sleep. I could not close my eyes without seeing Caroline standing in our hallway looking at me with pure disgust. I could not drift off without hearing Bradley laughing in that glass-walled boardroom, treating my entire existence like a punchline. I was 38 years old. I had spent over a decade saving lives, rushing into burning buildings, pulling shattered bodies out of crushed vehicles, and doing everything I was supposed to do to be a good, honest man. and my reward for a lifetime of integrity was a frozen night in a scrapyard locked out of my own home with exactly $38 to my name. As the pale gray light of morning finally began to break through the heavy rain clouds, I forced myself to sit up. My joints screamed in protest. My neck was stiff and my stomach twisted with a deep, hollow hunger. But I refused to let the despair drown me. I was a paramedic. I was trained to operate in the middle of chaos. When a patient is bleeding out, you do not sit down and cry. You assess the trauma, you stop the bleeding, and you keep them breathing. I had to apply that same triage to my own life. I needed a lawyer. I needed someone who could fight Caroline in family court so I could see my children, and someone who could challenge Bradley in probate court. Lawyers required money. They required massive retainers that I did not have. But I had a job. I was a senior paramedic at one of the busiest precincts in the city. If I picked up every single available overtime shift, if I worked 80 hours a week and slept in the truck between calls, I could scrape together enough cash for a legal retainer within a month. It was a brutal, punishing plan, but it was a plan. It was a way to fight back. I put the tarnished brass key into the ignition of the Silverado. I prayed silently, hoping the old engine had not completely seized up during its decade in storage. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a heavy, uneven rumble. It sounded rough, but it was running. I turned on the heater, waiting for the warm air to blast through the vents, but it only pushed out a lukewarm, dusty breeze. It was barely enough to defrost the windshield, but I did not care. I threw the truck into gear and drove out of the muddy impound lot, heading straight toward the downtown emergency medical services precinct. The drive took nearly an hour in the morning traffic. By the time I pulled into the precinct parking lot, my hands were numb from the cold steering wheel. I parked the truck in the back corner, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked toward the staff entrance. This brick building was my sanctuary. These people were my real family. The men and women in this precinct knew exactly what kind of man I was, because we had stood together in the worst situations imaginable. I walked through the double doors, heading toward the locker room to change into a fresh uniform and check the overtime board. But the moment I stepped into the main dispatch hall, the atmosphere felt completely wrong. Usually the morning shift change was loud. It was filled with dark humor, people complaining about the coffee and the clatter of equipment bags being loaded. Today, it was dead silent. A group of 4 paramedics were standing near the vending machines. When they saw me walk in, they stopped talking instantly. They looked down at the floor or quickly turned their heads away. No one offered a greeting. No one made a joke about my exhausted appearance. The heavy, oppressive silence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked past the dispatch desk and the shift supervisor would not even meet my eyes. She just stared at her computer monitor, her jaw tight. Before I could even reach the locker room, I heard the heavy door of the captain office open. Captain Miller stepped out into the hallway. He was a veteran of the department, a man I deeply respected. A man who had personally pinned my senior badge on my chest 3 years ago. His face was pale and his posture was completely rigid. "Harrison," he called out. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "Come into my office. Right now." I stopped walking. The tone of his voice sent a shockwave of pure panic straight through my exhausted body. I changed direction and walked into his office. The room was small and smelled heavily of stale coffee and paperwork. Sitting in the corner chair was a man I did not recognize. He wore a cheap gray suit and held a thick manila folder resting on his knees. He did not introduce himself. He just stared at me with an expression of absolute contempt. "Shut the door," Miller instructed. I closed the door behind me, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What is going on, Captain?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just coming in to sign up for the weekend overtime shifts. I need to pick up as many hours as possible right now." Miller walked behind his desk, but he did not sit down. He placed both hands flat on the wooden surface and looked down at his blotter. "I need your badge, Harrison," he said quietly. "I need your badge, your precinct access card, and your radio." I stared at him, completely incapable of processing the words he had just spoken. "Excuse me," I asked, thinking I had misheard him over the ringing in my ears. "Hand them over." The man in the gray suit said sharply, standing up from his chair. "I am Investigator Davis with the Internal Affairs Division. You are being stripped of your credentials effective immediately pending a joint investigation with federal medical authorities." I felt the floor drop out from under me. "Investigation?" I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. "Federal authorities? What are you talking about? I have a spotless record. I have never had a single disciplinary mark in 10 years. What exactly am I being investigated for?" Captain Miller finally looked up at me. His eyes were filled with a mixture of profound disappointment and deep sadness. "We received an anonymous tip late last night," Miller said, his voice heavy. "A highly detailed tip. It was routed directly to the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration and copied to the State Medical Board. The tip alleged that you have been systematically stealing medical-grade fentanyl from the ambulance lockboxes for the past 6 months. It alleged that you have been replacing the vials with saline solution and selling the narcotics to a local distributor." The words hit me like a physical punch to the face. I actually stumbled backward, my shoulders hitting the closed door. "That is insane!" I shouted, the volume of my voice rattling the small office. "That is a complete and absolute lie. You know me, Captain. You know I would never do something like that. I am the one who catches the inventory mistakes. I am the one who audits the medication logs. Someone is setting me up." Davis stepped forward, opening the manila folder. "The tip was not just a phone call, Harrison. It included dates, specific transport routes, and a list of inventory discrepancies that magically match your exact shift schedule. It also included a tip about severe financial distress. We ran a preliminary background check this morning. You are drowning in over $40,000 of undisclosed credit card debt. You have the motive, you have the access, and we have the anonymous testimony." My mind raced, spinning so fast I felt physically dizzy. $40,000 of debt. The exact amount Caroline had racked up in secret. The exact amount that had only been brought to light yesterday afternoon. There was only one other person who could possibly know those exact numbers, who had the money and the power to fabricate a pristine, anonymous federal tip overnight. Bradley. This was not a random coincidence. This was a targeted clinical military grade strike against my life. Bradley knew that if I kept my job, I could eventually hire a lawyer. He knew that if I earned a paycheck, I might fight his salvage order on the truck. Or worse, I might start asking questions about the massive corporate empire he had just stolen. So he did not just take my inheritance. He reached across the city and completely eradicated my ability to earn a living. He used his corporate lawyers, his private investigators, and his endless resources to frame me for a federal crime. "Captain, you have to listen to me," I begged, stepping toward the desk. "This is my stepbrother. He inherited my father's entire company yesterday. He is trying to destroy me so I cannot contest the will. He is trying to drain my resources. Please, you have to look into this. You cannot just take my badge based on an anonymous email." "My hands are tied," Harry Miller said, his voice cracking slightly. "The federal authorities have already frozen your medical license. I have orders directly from the commissioner. You are suspended without pay indefinitely. If you step foot in an ambulance or attempt to treat a patient, you will be arrested on the spot. Hand over your credentials. Now." My hands shook violently as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my precinct access card. I unclipped my radio from my belt. Finally, I reached up and unpinned the silver paramedic badge from my chest. That badge meant everything to me. It represented a decade of blood, sweat, and absolute dedication to helping people. It was the one thing I was truly proud of. I placed the badge on the wooden desk. It made a dull, heavy sound. Davis scooped it up immediately and dropped it into an evidence bag. "You need to leave the premises," Davis ordered coldly. "We will contact you when we require a formal deposition. Do not attempt to contact any of your former co-workers." I did not say another word. There were no words left to say. I turned around, opened the door, and walked out of the office. I walked back through the dispatch hall. The silence was even heavier now. The people I had trained, the people I had shared meals with, the people who had trusted me with their lives in the field, they all looked at me like I was a criminal. Bradley had not just taken my job. He had destroyed my reputation. He had painted me as a drug thief, the lowest form of life in the medical community. I pushed through the double doors and walked back out into the freezing parking lot. The rain had turned into a harsh, icy drizzle. I climbed back into the cab of the rusty Silverado and slammed the door shut. I gripped the steering wheel, squeezing the cracked leather until my knuckles turned white. The sheer terrifying reality of my situation crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing building. I was completely homeless. I was facing a brutal, vicious divorce. I was locked out of my bank accounts with $38 to my name. And now I was stripped of my career, suspended without pay, and staring down the barrel of a federal narcotics investigation that could land me in a penitentiary for the next 20 years. Bradley had squeezed the life out of me with absolute perfection. He had ensured I had zero resources, zero credibility, and zero hope. I had nothing left but the clothes on my back and this rotting 30-year-old truck. I turned the key and the old engine rumbled to life. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the precinct lot. I had no destination. I could not go to a hotel. I could not go home. I could not go to a diner because I needed to save my last few dollars for food to survive the week. I drove aimlessly through the gray, wet streets of the city, my mind a blank void of sheer panic and despair. The freezing rain continued to batter the windshield. I reached out and turned the dial for the heater, hoping to get just a little bit of warmth to stop my teeth from chattering. The moment I turned the dial to maximum heat, a loud, grinding screech echoed from behind the dashboard. A foul smell of burning dust and melting plastic flooded the small cabin. A second later, the blower motor completely died. The faint trickle of lukewarm air stopped instantly. The truck cabin immediately began to turn into an icebox. The windshield started to fog, overblocking my vision. I hit the dashboard with the heel of my hand, screaming in pure frustration. Even this piece of junk was giving up on me. I rubbed the foggy glass with my sleeve, desperately trying to see the road. I was shivering so violently I could barely hold the steering wheel straight. I needed to fix the blower motor or I would literally freeze to death sleeping in the truck tonight. I squinted through the rain and spotted a desolate, dimly lit gas station sitting on a deserted stretch of the industrial road. I quickly jerked the steering wheel and pulled the sputtering truck under the flickering canopy. I put it in park and stared at the jammed, rusted glove box, knowing I needed to break it open to find a screwdriver or any tool left behind that could help me take apart the dashboard. The icy drizzle had turned into a relentless driving sleet by the time I pulled the sputtering Chevy Silverado under the flickering canopy of an empty gas station. The station looked completely abandoned. The convenience store windows were dark, boarded up with wet plywood, and the single functioning fluorescent light above the fuel pumps buzzed with a harsh, erratic hum. I put the truck in park and left the engine running, hoping that the massive V8 block would generate enough radiant heat through the firewall to keep me from freezing to death. The blower motor was completely dead. The cabin temperature was plummeting rapidly, matching the bitter November cold outside. My breath formed thick white clouds in the dark interior. My damp paramedic uniform clung to my skin like ice. I was shivering so violently that my hands shook against the steering wheel. I needed to fix the heater. I had absolutely no other option. I could not afford a tow truck. I could not afford a motel room. With exactly $38 to my name, my entire existence was confined to the rusted metal shell of this 30-year-old pickup truck. I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned across the cracked vinyl bench seat toward the passenger side. I needed a tool, a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, a tire iron, Anything that would allow me to pop the dashboard panels off and access the blower motor wiring. I reached for the glove box latch and pulled. It did not budge. I pulled harder, my frozen fingers slipping against the worn plastic. The mechanism was rusted solid, fused together by decades of sitting in a damp, unheated storage unit near the airport. I hit the latch with the heel of my hand, but it remained completely jammed. A sudden, overwhelming wave of pure frustration crashed over me. It was not just about the jammed glove box. It was the crushing weight of the last 24 hours compressing my chest until I could barely breathe. I thought about my wife Caroline standing in our warm suburban home, locking me out into the rain with a face completely devoid of love. I thought about the $40,000 of secret debt she had accumulated waiting for my father to die so she could cash in on his corpse. I thought about Captain Miller taking my badge, looking at me with profound disappointment because an anonymous email had labeled me a drug thief. And I thought about Bradley. I pictured my younger half-brother sitting in that glass-walled boardroom in his custom-tailored suit, laughing at my life, treating my decade of public service as a pathetic joke, and casually demanding I sign this exact truck over to a scrapyard to be crushed into a cube of metal. They had taken everything. They had stripped me of my family, my home, my career, and my dignity. They had left me with absolutely nothing but this frozen, rotting box of steel. And now, even this piece of junk was fighting me. I let out a raw, guttural scream of pure anger. I lay back on the bench seat, pulled my knees up to my chest, and drove the heavy heel of my work boot directly into the glove box door. The impact echoed loudly in the small cabin. The plastic cracked, but it did not give way. I pulled my leg back and kicked it again, putting every ounce of my rage, my betrayal, and my desperation into the strike. The heavy plastic shattered with a sharp, violent snap. The glove box door ripped off its hinges and dropped onto the floor mat. I sat up, breathing heavily, my chest heaving as I stared at the damage I had just done. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the rain-slicked windshield, I realized something was wrong. The space behind the broken glove box was not a normal compartment. When the plastic door fell away, a heavy solid steel backing plate fell with it. That plate should have been bolted directly to the firewall of the truck. Instead, it had been secured with hidden, easily removable clips. I reached my trembling hands into the dark cavity of the dashboard. My fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and rigid. It was not a bundle of old vehicle registration papers or a forgotten owner manual. It was a box. I gripped the edges of it and pulled, but it was wedged tightly into the modified dashboard frame held in place by two thick industrial-grade zip ties. I reached down to the floorboard, grabbed a sharp, jagged piece of the shattered plastic glove box door, and began sawing frantically at the thick plastic restraints. It took 5 minutes of grueling, painful work. The sharp plastic sliced into my knuckles, drawing blood, but I did not care. My paramedic instincts were firing on all cylinders. My heart was racing. Bradley had demanded I sign a legal waiver to have this exact truck crushed by his personal salvage team by the end of the day. He had been visibly sweating when I refused. He had fabricated a federal drug tip to destroy my career and drain my resources just to stop me from asking questions. The thick zip ties finally snapped. I grabbed the handle of the object and pulled it free from the dashboard cavity. I rested it on the passenger seat. It was a heavy-duty black Pelican case, completely waterproof and crush-proof. It was covered in a thick layer of fine gray dust, indicating it had been hidden inside this truck for a very long time. It felt like it weighed at least 10 pounds. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the heavy metal latches on the sides of the case. I flipped them open. They unsealed with a loud, pressurized hiss. I opened the lid. Inside the case, the black protective foam had been custom cut to perfectly hold 3 specific items. The first was a small black micro cassette recorder. The second was a thick, heavy brass key. The third was a large leather-bound financial ledger, the kind used for manual offline bookkeeping. I picked up the brass key first. It was cold and heavy in my palm. Stamped into the thick metal was the logo for a private old-school credit union located in the financial district of Chicago, along with a deeply engraved box number. It was the kind of vault key used for high security off-the-grid physical storage. Next, I pulled out the heavy leather ledger. I opened the thick cover. The pages were absolutely filled with my father's meticulous, tight handwriting. I flipped through the first dozen pages, my eyes scanning the columns of numbers and corporate acronyms. These were not the standard financial records of sterling commercial real estate. These were tracking logs for offshore bank routing numbers, massive wire transfers, and anonymous shell companies registered in overseas tax havens. I saw transaction amounts listed for $4 million, $12 million, and $20 million. But what made my blood turn completely to ice were the signatures next to every single massive transfer of funds. Next to every date, next to every routing number was my stepbrother Bradley's signature. And directly beneath his signature, countersigning the transactions, was the signature of my stepmother Cynthia. I stared at the pages, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the numbers. My father had built a legitimate empire over 30 years, but this ledger was tracking a shadow economy. Bradley and Cynthia were moving tens of millions of dollars entirely off the books. I dropped the ledger onto the seat and reached for the final item in the case, the micro-cassette recorder. The tape was already loaded inside the device. I pressed my thumb against the small play button. The internal speaker hissed with a brief burst of static, and then a voice filled the freezing silent cabin of the truck. It was my father. But it was not the strong, commanding corporate voice I had known my entire life. It was not the voice of the man who gave orders from a glass boardroom. The voice on the tape was breathless, strained, and filled with an overwhelming, suffocating terror. He sounded weak. He sounded like a man who knew he was running out of time. Harry, the voice crackled through the small speaker. If you are holding this, it means I am gone. And it means my heart did not fail on its own. I stopped breathing. The freezing temperature inside the truck suddenly meant nothing. Every muscle in my body locked completely tight. I stared at the small black recorder on the seat, completely paralyzed. I have made terrible mistakes, Harry. My father continued, his voice shaking. I let the company grow too fast. I trusted the wrong people. About 5 years ago, Bradley and Cynthia brought in a group of foreign investors to back our downtown high-rise projects. I thought they were just aggressive venture capitalists. I was wrong. I was so arrogant and so blind. They have been using our real estate firm to launder shell company money for an international cartel. They use our property acquisitions to wash dirty cash, and Bradley has been facilitating every single transaction. I closed my eyes. The pieces of the nightmare were falling into place with terrifying speed. Bradley inheriting the entire company. The desperate rush to scrap the old truck. The sheer panic in his eyes when I refused to hand over the keys. When I finally discovered what they were doing, my father's recorded voice rasped. I confronted Cynthia. That was my fatal mistake. I told her I was going to contact the authorities and initiate a full federal audit. Since that night, I have been getting sick. My heart medication is not working. I feel weak all the time. I know what they are doing to me, Harry. They are making it look like a natural physical decline. They are poisoning me. A tear escaped my eye and tracked down my cold cheek. My father was murdered in slow motion by the woman he married and the son he raised. He had died in his own bed, and the doctors had simply written it off as sudden cardiac arrest in a stressed corporate executive. I knew they would lock you out of the will, my father said on the tape, his breath catching painfully. I knew Bradley would take the company. He needs the corporate infrastructure to keep the cartel happy. But they do not know about this truck, Harry. They do not know I retrofitted the dashboard years ago. They are going to realize the ledger is missing, and when they do, they will panic. They need this truck destroyed because the ledger in your hands contains every single forged signature and every illegal routing number that proves their guilt. It is the only physical evidence that can destroy them. The tape paused for a few seconds. I could hear my father taking slow, ragged breaths in the background. But I did not just leave you a book of crimes. My father's voice returned a little stronger this time. I spent the last 8 months quietly liquidating every clean, untainted asset I legally owned. I separated the clean money from the corrupt firm. The brass key in that case unlocks a private security vault. Inside that vault, you will find the true clean assets of the Sterling estate. You will also find the original unencumbered land deeds to the firm's most critical properties. Bradley thinks he inherited the empire, but he does not legally own the ground his buildings are standing on. You do. My chest heaved. Bradley inherited the debt, the cartel liability, and the corporate shell. I inherited the actual physical wealth. My father had not disinherited me. He had used the public reading of the will as a smokescreen to hand me the real empire while handing Bradley a ticking time bomb. Listen to me very carefully, Harry. My father pleaded, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Do not go to the local police. Bradley has half the precinct captains in this city on the corporate payroll. They will bury the evidence and you will disappear. You take this ledger to the federal authorities, and you protect yourself. I am so sorry I pushed you away. I am so sorry I let the money blind me. You were the only one who lived an honest life. You were the only one I could trust to finish this. I love you, son. The tape hissed for another second and then clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat in the freezing darkness, my hand hovering over the small black recorder. The rusted truck I had driven out of the impound lot was not an insult. It was a vault. It was a weapon. My father had reached out from the grave and handed me the exact tools I needed to destroy the people who had murdered him. My mind snapped back to my own reality. Bradley had already moved against me. He had used his connections to file the fake drug theft charges. He had stripped my medical badge so I could not defend myself. He had made sure I was broke and homeless because a broke homeless man with no credibility cannot walk into a federal building and make accusations against an $85 million corporate CEO. Bradley was not just trying to steal my inheritance. He was actively hunting the evidence. Suddenly, a blinding wash of bright white light flooded the cabin of the truck. I threw my arm up to shield my eyes. High-beam headlights were cutting straight through the dark, icy rain aimed directly at my windshield. I squinted against the glare. A massive, sleek black SUV had just pulled into the abandoned gas station. The driver hit the brakes hard, sliding slightly on the wet pavement, and angled the heavy vehicle perfectly across the front of my truck, boxing me in completely. There was no room to pull forward. My heart slammed against my ribs. I reached down instantly and threw the Pelican case onto the floorboard, kicking it far under the passenger seat so it was completely hidden in the shadows. I dropped my heavy winter coat over the broken Glovebox hole to conceal the damage. The doors of the black SUV swung open simultaneously. 2 men stepped out into the freezing rain. They were not wearing police uniforms. They were not wearing security jackets. They were dressed in dark, heavy, tactical clothing. They pulled their hoods up against the weather, but the harsh, fluorescent light from the gas station canopy caught the dull, heavy metal objects they were pulling from their sides. They were holding solid steel crowbars. They did not rush. They walked with a calm, terrifying purpose, moving in absolute synchronization. One man walked toward the front bumper of my truck, raising his crowbar slightly. The other man walked directly toward my driver's side door. Bradley did not just send them to tow a rusted piece of junk to a scrapyard. He sent them because he had finally figured out where the ledger was hidden. He sent them to take the truck, and he did not care if I was sitting inside it when they did. The man approaching my door raised his free hand and tapped heavily on my rain-slicked window. "Roll it down," the man ordered, his voice muffled but sharp through the glass. "Hand over the keys, Harry. We are taking the truck." I looked at the steel crowbar in his hand. I looked at the man blocking the front grille. I felt the cold, hard brass key resting in my pocket. I realized in that exact second that the worst day of my life was not over. It was only just beginning. And if I did not fight my way out of this gas station right now, I was going to die in the exact same rusted truck my father had left me. The two men in dark tactical gear walked out of the sleek black SUV with absolute terrifying purpose. The freezing rain battered their heavy jackets as they moved directly toward my truck. They were not local street thugs looking for a quick robbery. They moved with a clinical military precision that made my blood run entirely cold. One man stepped directly in front of my grill, blocking any chance of me pulling forward. He raised a solid steel crowbar, resting it casually against his shoulder. The second man walked straight to my driver's side door. I had no time to think. I had no time to panic. I reached for the door lock, pressing it down right as the man arrived at my window. He did not knock. He did not ask me to roll the window down. He simply pulled back his arm and drove the heavy curved end of the steel crowbar directly into the center of the driver's side glass. The ancient safety glass exploded inward with a deafening crash. A shower of sharp, freezing fragments ripped across the cabin, slicing into my cheek and the back of my hands. The freezing wind and driving rain instantly flooded the interior of the truck. Before I could even react to the shock of the broken window, the man reached his thick, gloved hand through the jagged opening. He grabbed the collar of my damp paramedic uniform and twisted his grip violently. He was not trying to beat me. He was trying to physically drag me out of the driver's seat through the shattered window so his partner could secure the vehicle. "Hand over the keys right now," the man shouted over the roaring wind. "We are taking this truck." But my brother Bradley had made a massive miscalculation. He thought I was just a weak, pathetic ambulance driver who would fold under pressure. He did not understand that paramedics do not just hand out bandages. I had spent the last 10 years fighting combative patients in the back of moving ambulances. I had wrestled with people out of their minds on heavy narcotics, people who fought with hysterical, desperate strength. My training and my adrenaline took over instantly. I did not pull away from him. Instead, I lunged forward, grabbing his thick wrist with both of my hands. I twisted his arm violently downward against the jagged glass remaining in the window frame. He yelled out in pain as the glass bit through his glove. In that same fraction of a second, I drove my right elbow directly up and out, smashing the point of my bone straight into his throat. The man choked, coughing violently, and stumbled backward into the pouring rain. His grip on my collar released. I knew I only had seconds before the man in front of the truck made his move. The man at the grill raised his crowbar high above his head and brought it down with crushing force onto the hood of my truck, leaving a massive, deep dent in the metal. He yelled to his partner and started running toward the passenger side, aiming to smash that window next. I knew if he got inside the cabin, they would drag me out into the mud, take the truck, and completely erase the only evidence that proved my innocence and my father's murder. I dropped my right hand to the gear shift. The old V8 engine was still rumbling, barely holding on in the cold. I pulled the heavy shifter all the way down into reverse. I slammed my boot down onto the gas pedal with everything I had. The heavy 30-year-old rear tires spun wildly on the slick, wet pavement of the gas station for a terrifying second before finally finding their grip. The heavy truck shot backward with incredible speed. I did not look back. I just braced myself for the impact. The heavy steel rear bumper of my Silverado crashed directly into the front quarter panel of their expensive black SUV. The sound of tearing metal and shattering plastic echoed over the storm. Their passenger side headlight exploded into a blinding shower of sparks. The violent force of the collision snapped my neck back against the headrest, but the heavy steel frame of my truck had completely crushed the front end of their vehicle, clearing my path to the street. I immediately threw the gear shift back up into drive, spun the steering wheel as hard as I could to the left, and gunned the engine. The Chevy Silverado roared out from under the flickering canopy of the gas station. The man who had been at the passenger side ran after me, throwing his heavy steel crowbar at my tailgate. It bounced off the rusted metal harmlessly and clattered into the dark street. I merged onto the deserted industrial road, pushing the speedometer up to 60 miles an hour. I was flying blindly into the freezing, relentless storm, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force I thought my chest would crack open. I drove erratically for 20 minutes, taking random sharp turns through the decaying industrial district of the city. I watched my rearview mirror, obsessively waiting to see a single working headlight gaining on me in the dark. But the road remained entirely pitch black. There was no pursuit. Their vehicle was too badly damaged to follow. The freezing air blasting through the shattered driver's side window was agonizing. The rain soaked the entire left side of my body, chilling my wet uniform straight through to my skin. I was shivering violently, but the physical pain actually kept me sharp. I navigated away from the main highways, driving deep into an abandoned, overgrown commercial sector on the edge of the city limits. I finally spotted an old, boarded-up strip mall sitting at the end of a dead-end street. Tall weeds were growing straight through the cracked asphalt of the massive empty parking lot. I steered the truck behind the rotting concrete structure, hiding my vehicle completely from the main road. I turned off the headlights, killed the engine, and sat in the total suffocating darkness. The silence was absolutely deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the metal roof of the cab. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them hard against my thighs just to make them stop. That was not a random carjacking. Bradley had ordered those men to steal the truck for the salvage yard tonight before I could discover the hidden compartment. They were willing to pull me through a broken window to get it. I reached down into the dark shadows under the passenger seat and pulled the heavy black Pelican case back up into my lap. I reached inside and pulled out the thick leather-bound ledger. I dug through my duffel bag and found a small cheap pen light I always carried for medical exams. I clicked it on, aiming the narrow, sharp beam of white light directly onto the yellowed pages of the heavy book. I needed to understand exactly what Bradley and Cynthia were doing. I needed to know exactly why my father had to die. I started reading the entries from 3 years ago. At first glance, the numbers seemed like standard, albeit massive commercial real estate acquisitions. There was a purchase of a suburban office park for $6 million. There were renovation budgets listed for $2 million. But as I looked closer, moving the small beam of light down the columns, the true horror of the operation began to reveal itself. My father had meticulously highlighted the financial discrepancies in red ink. The properties were not being purchased through our standard domestic banking partners. They were being purchased through anonymous shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, Panama, and Cyprus. The massive renovation budgets were entirely fake. There were no contractors, no construction materials, and no actual work being done on those buildings. Instead, tens of millions of dollars in untraceable foreign cash were being wired into our corporate accounts under the guise of international property investments. The dirty money was being scrubbed clean through our domestic real estate holdings, turned into legitimate corporate revenue on paper, and then funneled back out through highly overvalued commercial property sales. It was a textbook massive-scale money laundering operation for an international drug cartel, and Cynthia was the architect. I read my father's small, frantic handwritten notes in the margins of the pages. Cynthia had used her background in high-level corporate finance to set up the blind trusts and the offshore routing numbers. She had completely isolated my father from the daily accounting over the last 5 years, claiming she was just taking the stress off his failing heart. She had manipulated him perfectly. But Bradley was the one executing the deals on the ground. I turned page after page, shining the light on the bottom corner of every single fraudulent wire transfer document. Bradley's signature was on every single page. He was acting as the cartel's personal corporate broker. He was moving dirty blood money, buying up entire city blocks, and pretending to be a brilliant young executive while he was actually just a glorified criminal courier. His $85 million empire was built entirely on criminal fraud. My stomach twisted into a tight, sickening knot as I reached the final pages of the ledger. The neat, precise handwriting of my father began to deteriorate. The letters became sloppy and jagged. It was the handwriting of a man whose nervous system was failing. I read his final notes documenting his physical decline. He had realized the truth too late. When he finally confronted Cynthia when he threatened to expose the entire operation to the federal authorities and trigger an audit, his heart medication suddenly stopped working. He documented his symptoms: the constant dizziness, the shortness of breath, the sudden terrifying chest pains. They began poisoning him in his own home. They murdered him slowly, clinically, to protect their criminal empire and secure their corporate power. The sheer terrifying scale of their evil made me physically sick. I opened the door of the truck, leaned out into the freezing rain, and vomited onto the cracked asphalt. I sat back up, wiping my mouth with the back of my wet, shivering sleeve. I closed the heavy leather ledger and put it back into the waterproof case, snapping the latches shut. I now held the absolute irrefutable proof of their crimes. I held the exact ledger that would send my stepmother and my stepbrother to a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. But I also held a massive, deadly target on my back. Bradley had the money to hire endless teams of men in tactical gear like the ones at the gas station. He had the political connections to influence local police precincts and internal affairs investigators. If I walked into a regular city police station right now and handed over this ledger, an officer on Bradley's payroll would intercept it. The evidence would vanish into an evidence room, and I would be found floating in the freezing waters of the Chicago River before the weekend was over. I could not go to the local authorities. I could not go to my old friends or my co-workers because Caroline knew all of them. She would gladly call Bradley and tell him exactly where I was hiding just to secure her own financial payout from the upcoming divorce. I was completely and utterly isolated. I leaned my head back against the cracked vinyl seat, staring at the dark ceiling of the truck cab. The freezing wind whipped through the broken window, but the burning anger in my chest was keeping me warm. I thought back to the micro-cassette tape. My father had spoken with absolute clarity about one specific location. He had told me to find the private security vault. He had left the heavy brass key in the case for a specific reason, and he had explicitly mentioned the name Thomas Vance. Thomas was an old retired bank manager who used to sit 2 pews behind us at our local church when I was just a kid. He was an honorable, quiet, deeply principled man who never cared about the massive wealth and the corporate status my father accumulated later in life. My father had trusted Thomas enough to hide the clean assets and the unencumbered land deeds inside his private off-the-grid credit union. If I was going to survive this nightmare, if I was going to strike back at Bradley and completely dismantle the empire he had stolen, I needed those clean assets. I needed the true wealth of the Sterling estate to fund my counterattack. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, fighting off the freezing cold, and stared out into the dark, rain-swept parking lot. I had to wait for the morning. I had to stay alive and hidden until the sun came up. And the moment the doors opened, I was going to find Thomas Vance. The rain had finally stopped just before dawn, leaving the city looking frozen and entirely gray. I had not slept a single second. I spent the entire night sitting in the cab of the hidden truck behind the abandoned strip mall, clutching the heavy black Pelican case to my chest. Every time a stray car drove past the decaying parking lot, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I expected to see the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser, or worse, the dark grille of another tactical SUV. I was a hunted man in my own city. I was completely broke, suspended from my job, falsely accused of federal narcotics theft, and running from a stepbrother who had just inherited an $85 million criminal empire. I was at the absolute bottom of my life. But the heavy leather ledger resting inside the waterproof case on my lap was a weapon. I just needed to survive long enough to use it. At 7 a.m, the weak winter sun barely pierced through the heavy cloud cover. I turned the ignition key. The old Chevy engine groaned in protest, grinding loudly before finally catching and rumbling to life. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the shadows, heading straight toward the downtown financial district. I felt the deep, bone-chilling exhaustion in every single fiber of my muscles. I was wearing a damp, wrinkled paramedic uniform that smelled like rain and sweat. I had dried blood on my knuckles from smashing the glove box and from striking the man who had tried to drag me out of my window at the gas station. My face was bruised and my hands were shaking. I looked like a dangerous, desperate vagrant. I certainly did not look like a man who was about to inherit a fortune. I navigated the busy morning traffic and finally located the address my father had written on the back of the brass key tag. It was not a towering modern bank with giant digital billboards. It was an old classical stone building tucked quietly between two massive glass skyscrapers. It was a private credit union. It was the kind of exclusive financial institution that did not advertise to the public and only accepted clients through strict personal referrals. I parked my rusted truck 2 blocks away in a public garage, paying the attendant with a few of the last dollar bills I had in my pocket. I tucked the heavy Pelican case tightly under my winter coat and walked down the bustling sidewalk. I pulled open the heavy brass doors of the credit union and stepped inside. The interior was breathtakingly quiet. It was lined with dark mahogany wood, polished brass fixtures, and deep green marble floors. It smelled like old paper expensive coffee and complete silence. A large security guard wearing a tailored suit immediately stepped away from the wall, his eyes locking onto my ragged, bloody appearance. His hand drifted toward his radio, clearly intending to throw me out onto the street before I could ruin the atmosphere for the wealthy clients. Before the guard could take another step, a voice echoed firmly from the open doorway of a back office. "Leave him be," the voice commanded. I looked up and saw an older man with thinning gray hair and kind, highly perceptive eyes walking quickly across the marble floor. He was wearing a classic, impeccably tailored 3-piece suit. I recognized his face instantly. It was Thomas Vance. He was a retired commercial bank manager who used to sit 2 pews behind my family at our local church 30 years ago. That was back when my father was just a hardworking, honest real estate agent long before the massive corporate wealth and my stepmother Cynthia had completely corrupted our family tree. Thomas walked right up to me. He did not flinch at my bruised face or my dirty uniform. He looked at me with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. "Your father told me to wait for the boy with the brass key," Thomas said, quietly reaching out to shake my hand. I gripped his hand, feeling a sudden massive lump form in my throat. "You knew he was coming to you?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly from the exhaustion. Thomas nodded, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder and guiding me away from the lobby and into a secure private hallway. "Richard came to me 8 months ago," Thomas explained, his voice dropping to a hushed whisper. "He looked terrible, Harrison. He was shaking, he was pale, and he looked terrified of his own shadow. He told me that his wife and his youngest son had trapped him in something incredibly dangerous. He knew they were monitoring his phone calls, his emails, and his corporate bank accounts. He needed an institution that was completely off the digital grid, a place where Bradley could not use his corporate lawyers to track the money. He trusted me because I knew him before he was a titan. I knew him when he was just a father who loved his oldest son." Thomas led me to a heavy, solid steel vault door at the end of the corridor. He swiped a key card and entered a long security code. The massive metal door hissed and swung open, revealing a wall of hundreds of stainless steel safety deposit boxes. "He did not abandon you," Harrison Thomas said, looking me directly in the eyes. "Your father knew they would try to destroy you if you received a public inheritance. He knew Bradley would contest the will and freeze your life in court for decades. So your father used the public will as a distraction. He gave them the poisoned corporate shell, and he spent his last 8 months of life quietly bleeding the clean, legitimate wealth out of the company to save it for you." Thomas stopped in front of a massive deposit drawer near the bottom row. It was 3 times the size of a standard box. He pulled a master key from his pocket and inserted it into the left lock. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key I had found inside the truck, and inserted it into the right lock. We turned them at the exact same time. The internal mechanisms clicked heavily, and Thomas pulled the long metal drawer out on its tracks. We carried it together into a small windowless viewing room, setting it down on a felt-lined table. "Open it," Thomas instructed quietly. I lifted the heavy metal lid. I expected to find a few stacks of $100 bills or maybe a modest trust fund document. What I saw made my lungs completely stop working. The box was absolutely filled to the brim with physical wealth. On the left side, there were dozens of thick, heavy bars of solid platinum and gold gleaming under the bright overhead lights of the viewing room. On the right side, neatly bound in protective plastic sleeves, were massive stacks of certified unregistered bearer bonds. Digital money leaves a trail, Thomas explained, watching my face go completely pale in shock. Bradley has corporate accountants who can trace wire transfers anywhere in the world. But physical gold and unregistered bearer bonds are completely untraceable. Whoever holds the physical paper holds the legal money. Your father liquidated his private stock options and his personal accounts. He purchased these assets entirely under the radar and walked them into this vault by hand. You are looking at a total valuation of nearly $20 million. I stared at the gold. I stared at the bonds. My hands started to shake so violently I had to grip the edge of the table just to remain standing. Less than 12 hours ago, my wife Caroline had screamed in my face, calling me a financially pathetic loser. She had thrown my entire life into the trash, mocking me for being weak, and completely drained our joint savings account because she thought I had lost. She thought I was worthless. But standing in this vault looking at $20 million of untraceable wealth, I realized the absolute magnitude of my father's love. He had not viewed me as a disappointment. He had viewed me as his only salvation. He had trusted me with his true legacy because I was the only person in his life who could not be bought. "There is more," Thomas said gently, reaching into the bottom of the metal drawer. Beneath the gold and the bonds were 3 thick red legal folders. Thomas pulled them out and placed them on the table in front of me. I opened the first folder. It was a massive stack of complex legal contracts, completely covered in municipal stamps and official state notary seals. "I am a paramedic," I said, looking down at the dense legal jargon. "I do not understand what I'm looking at." "What are these?" "These are the kill switches," Thomas said, a fierce protective pride entering his voice. "Bradley inherited the corporate entity of Sterling Commercial Real Estate. He owns the brand name, the office furniture, the employee contracts, and the liability of the buildings. But he does not own the Dirt Harrison." I looked up at Thomas, confused. "What do you mean he does not own the dirt?" 8 months ago, your father quietly executed a series of irrevocable corporate land transfers," Thomas explained, tapping his finger firmly on the notary seals. "He took the actual physical plots of land that the company's most expensive high-rises are built on, and he transferred the ownership of that land into a blind private trust. The sole beneficiary of that blind trust is you." The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. "Bradley is building a $300 million downtown development right now," Thomas continued, a sharp smile forming on his face. "He is signing contracts with international investors. He is moving dirty cartel money through the construction budgets. But he is building those towers on land that technically belongs to you. In commercial real estate, this is called a ground lease. If the tenant violates the moral turpitude clause of the ground lease by engaging in criminal activity, the landowner has the absolute legal right to instantly terminate the lease and seize the physical buildings sitting on their property." I felt the blood rushing in my ears. Bradley had spent yesterday afternoon laughing at me in the boardroom, mocking me for taking a rusty truck. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea that my father had secretly placed the literal ground beneath his feet into my hands. Bradley was not the king of an empire. He was a trespasser on my property. With a single signature, I could legally evict his entire criminal corporation and seize every single building he claimed to own. "This is genius," I whispered, staring at the land deeds. He trapped him perfectly. "Yes," Thomas agreed, his expression suddenly growing incredibly serious. "But a trap is only good if you live long enough to spring it." Just as he spoke those words, the secure telephone mounted on the wall of the viewing room began to ring. The shrill, piercing sound made me jump. Thomas walked over and picked up the receiver. He listened for a few seconds. I watched all the color completely drain from his face. He did not say a word. He just hung up the phone slowly and turned back to me. His eyes were wide with sudden panic. "You need to pack this money right now," Thomas said, his voice tight and urgent. "What is happening?" I asked already, grabbing handfuls of the bearer bonds and shoving them directly into the waterproof Pelican case alongside the heavy leather ledger. "That was my security desk," Thomas replied, moving to the table to help me load the heavy bars of gold into the case. "Bradley's legal team is moving faster than we anticipated. They just filed a massive emergency court injunction. They are using those fake federal drug theft charges they set you up with to convince a judge that you are a flight risk and a narcotics trafficker." I froze for a split second, my hand hovering over a stack of platinum. "What does that mean?" "It means they secured a federal asset forfeiture warrant." Thomas said, his hands moving frantically to pack the last of the deeds into the case. Asset forfeiture allows law enforcement to instantly freeze and physically seize any money, property, or safety deposit boxes tied to your social security number even before you are convicted of a crime. Bradley is weaponizing the government to hunt down the missing corporate assets. The electronic sweep of the state banking system has just been initiated. They are actively pinging every financial institution in the region right now. My heart hammered against my ribs. "If they find this credit union," I said, realizing the terrifying speed of Bradley's attack. "If they find this credit union," Thomas interrupted, shutting the heavy lid of the Pelican case and locking the latches. "Federal marshals will walk through my front doors in less than an hour. They will legally seize this entire box. The $20 million will be confiscated. The land deeds will be frozen in federal evidence lockers for years, and Bradley will use the delay to completely liquidate the company and vanish with the cartel money. You have to leave this building immediately, Harrison. Once you step out those doors, you cannot use your name, you cannot use your credit cards, and you cannot be seen." I grabbed the heavy handle of the Pelican case. It weighed nearly 40 pounds, packed with my father's desperate dying love and the absolute destruction of my enemies. I looked at Thomas, feeling a wave of immense gratitude for the incredible risk he was taking by helping me. "Thank you," I said, looking him in the eye, "for protecting him, for protecting me." "Go," Thomas said, giving me a firm push toward the vault door. "Do not let your father's sacrifice be for nothing. Burn their empire to the ground." I walked out of the viewing room, hurried up the marble stairs, and pushed through the heavy brass doors of the credit union. I stepped back out into the freezing Chicago morning. The rain was still falling in a misty, icy drizzle. I held $20 million and the ultimate corporate kill switch in my hand, but I was still a hunted man with no badge and no home. I knew I could not go to the local police precinct. Bradley had already proven he owned the Internal Affairs Division, and if I walked into a station, I would be arrested on the fake drug charges before I could even open the case. I needed federal power. I needed someone completely outside of Bradley's sphere of influence. I walked 3 blocks away from the credit union, keeping my head down and avoiding the security cameras mounted on the banking buildings. I found a grimy, dimly lit corner convenience store. I walked inside, moving past the dusty shelves to the front counter. I pulled a crumpled $20 bill from my pocket, the very last of the cash I possessed in the world, and purchased a cheap disposable prepaid cell phone. I walked to the back of the store, sitting down on a cold concrete bench near the humming refrigerators. I set the heavy Pelican case on the floor between my boots. I opened the latches, reached inside, and pulled out the thick leather ledger. I flipped past the pages of forged wire transfers and cartel routing numbers until I found the very last page my father had written on. It was a single name and a direct, secure phone number for an FBI white-collar crimes agent based out of the federal field office. My father had written a note beside the number stating that this specific agent had been investigating the cartel for years and was the only man in the city who could not be bought by sterling commercial real estate. I picked up the cheap plastic burner phone. My hands were steady now. The fear and the panic had completely burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp, and absolute focus. I punched the numbers into the keypad, taking a deep breath as the line began to ring. I was no longer the broken paramedic sleeping in a frozen truck. I was the executioner, and I was about to bring the entire skyline crashing down on my brother's head. The rain had finally stopped just before dawn, leaving the city looking frozen and entirely gray. I had not slept a single second. I spent the early morning driving my rusted Chevy Silverado miles past the Chicago city limits, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights behind me looked like a potential threat. Every black SUV made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. I was a hunted man in my own city. I was suspended from my job, falsely accused of federal narcotics theft and running from a stepbrother who had just inherited an $85 million criminal empire. But the heavy leather ledger resting inside the waterproof Pelican case on my passenger seat was the ultimate weapon. I just needed to survive long enough to hand it to the right person. I finally pulled into the gravel parking lot of a run-down diner situated off a desolate stretch of the interstate. It was the exact location Agent Gregory Shaw had given me when I called the secure number from the back of the ledger using my disposable phone. I grabbed the thick manila envelope containing the photocopies of my father's financial logs and the backup recording of the microcassette. I pushed open the diner door. The entrance bell chimed weakly. The place smelled of burnt coffee and fried grease, a sharp contrast to the polished mahogany of the credit union vault I had stood in yesterday. The diner was completely empty except for a single waitress behind the counter and a man sitting in the very back corner booth. I spotted him immediately. He wore a plain brown suit and had the exhausted, sharp eyes of a man who spent his entire life chasing shadows. He sat facing the door, a steaming mug of black coffee in front of him. I walked over and slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. "Harrison," he said quietly. There was no handshake. There was no formal greeting. He just gave me a cold, assessing stare. "Your father told me he was gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. When he died suddenly, my entire investigation hit a massive brick wall. Tell me you have what he promised." I did not say a word. I simply slid the thick manila envelope across the sticky laminate table. Agent Shaw opened it. His eyes darted across the top page of the copied ledger. I watched his breathing change instantly. His posture stiffened. For 2 years, he told me his federal task force had been trying desperately to dismantle Sterling commercial real estate. They knew Bradley and Cynthia were laundering money for one of the most violent international cartels operating in North America. They knew the downtown high-rises were nothing but giant concrete washing machines for dirty cash. But Bradley was incredibly careful. He used endless layers of corporate shell companies' offshore accounts and highly paid attorneys to completely insulate himself from the actual transactions. "We had theories," Agent Shaw whispered, turning another page of the ledger with trembling fingers. "We had suspicions. But this is the absolute smoking gun. This is Bradley's direct signature, tying him explicitly to the cartel routing numbers in the Cayman Islands. Your father documented every single fraudulent wire transfer. He documented the fake construction budgets. We can finally link the cartel money directly to Bradley's personal accounts." But then Agent Shaw closed the folder, and his expression turned incredibly grim. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "There is a massive problem, Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Bradley has highly paid moles planted inside the state judicial system. That emergency asset forfeiture warrant he filed against you yesterday proves he is panicking. He knows this ledger exists somewhere. If we move on this right now through standard federal channels, the paperwork will hit the judicial system and his moles will tip him off immediately." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means Bradley will have a 24-hour head start," Agent Shaw replied bitterly. "He will instantly wire the cartel funds to non-extradition countries. He will board a private jet, and he will vanish completely. Cynthia will disappear right behind him. They will leave you holding the bag, facing those fabricated drug theft charges, and fighting their corporate lawyers for the rest of your natural life. They will win, Harrison. How do we stop him from running?" I demanded, my hands clenching into fists on the table. "We cannot arrest him in an office," Agent Shaw said, tapping his finger against the manila envelope. "We cannot give him time to make a single phone call to his offshore bankers. We have to catch him in a highly public, undeniable lie regarding the asset ownership right at the exact moment he is executing the final transfer of the illegal funds. We need a stage where he cannot run, a stage where the cartel investors are directly implicated on the spot, and where federal agents can lock down the perimeter before he even realizes he is trapped. As we sat there in the tense silence trying to formulate a plan that seemed entirely impossible, the cheap burner phone in my pocket vibrated loudly. I pulled it out. It was a voicemail notification. I had forwarded my old personal cell phone number to the burner just in case Captain Miller or the paramedic precinct called regarding my suspension. I pressed play and held the small speaker close to my ear. It was not the precinct. It was my ex-wife, Caroline. Her voice was dripping with a smug, toxic arrogance that made the blood in my veins boil. "Hello, Harrison," she said, her tone falsely sweet and incredibly cruel. "I am just calling to let you know that the children and I are doing wonderfully without you. In fact, Cynthia was kind enough to invite me as a VIP guest to Bradley's massive charity gala this Saturday night. It is the official corporate groundbreaking ceremony for the new $300 million downtown development project." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, listening to the sheer greed in her voice. "All the major international investors will be there," Caroline bragged loudly into the phone. "Bradley is signing the final corporate agreements on stage in front of the press. It is going to be absolutely spectacular. I am finally going to be surrounded by real wealth and real power, instead of settling for a pathetic ambulance driver who let his own family treat him like garbage. I hope you are enjoying sleeping in that rusted piece of junk. Have a nice life, Harrison." The voicemail clicked off. I slowly lowered the phone to the table. A cold, dangerous clarity washed over my entire mind. Bradley was not just throwing a party. He was hosting the final massive money laundering event right in the absolute center of the city. He was bringing the international cartel fronts into the exact same room to publicly sign the fraudulent development contracts. And he was doing it on the exact plots of land that my father had legally transferred to my name. "Agent Shaw," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I know exactly where and when we are going to trap him." I quickly explained the details of the voicemail. I told him about the $300 million gala scheduled for Saturday night. I told him that Bradley would be standing on a brightly lit stage in front of the local press and the foreign investors publicly signing away land development rights that he did not legally own. Agent Shaw's eyes widened in realization. If he signs those fraudulent land contracts in front of the foreign investors while actively executing the wire transfers on his tablet to finalize the deal that is federal wire fraud, international racketeering, and corporate perjury happening simultaneously in a highly public venue. Shaw said, his voice rising with excitement. "We can lock down the entire ballroom. We can seize the cartel buyers before they can authorize the offshore transfers. But to do that, someone has to be in the room to publicly challenge the ownership and stall the signing just long enough for my tactical teams to secure the perimeter without causing a panic. I will do it," I said without a single second of hesitation. "I will be in the room." Agent Shaw looked at my bruised face, my dirty calloused hands, and my wrinkled, blood-stained paramedic uniform. "Security at an event like this will be absolute," he warned, shaking his head. "Bradley will have private armed guards at every single door. You are a wanted man right now, Harrison. There is an active federal warrant out for your assets. You cannot just walk into a billionaire's gala looking like a fugitive off the street. They will throw you out before you even reach the ballroom floor." I reached into my heavy winter coat pocket and pulled out a thick banded stack of crisp $100 bills. It was a tiny fraction of the untraceable cash I had secured from the credit union vault. I dropped the money directly onto the sticky diner table. "I am not going to look like a fugitive," I told him, staring directly into his eyes. "I am going to look like an investor." I left the diner an hour later and drove straight back to the most exclusive financial district in Chicago. I was done hiding in the shadows. I was done acting like the weak, forgotten victim my family desperately wanted me to be. I parked the rusted Silverado in a secure private underground lot, paying the attendant for a full week in advance using the untraceable cash. I locked the Pelican case safely inside the cab. My first stop was a high-end bespoke tailor located on a prestigious avenue. I walked into the luxurious boutique. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fine fabric. The head salesman immediately looked at my damp, dirty uniform with clear disdain, stepping forward as if he was preparing to ask me to leave the premises. I did not give him the chance to speak. I dropped a massive stack of cash directly onto his pristine glass display counter. I told him I needed his absolute best custom tuxedo, tailored to fit me perfectly by tomorrow afternoon, and I did not care how much it cost. The salesman's attitude changed instantly. Money was the only language these people understood. I spent the next 2 days completely transforming myself. I used the clean money from the vault to book a luxury penthouse suite at a 5-star hotel under a secure corporate pseudonym. I stood under the scalding hot water of the marble shower, scrubbing away the grime of the impound lot and the smell of the hospital precinct. I shaved away the ragged, exhausted beard that made me look like a broken man. I watched the defeated, humiliated paramedic literally wash down the drain. When I finally stepped out and looked in the mirror, I saw someone entirely different. I saw a man who wielded $20 million of clean power. I saw a man who held the absolute destruction of his enemies in the palm of his hand. Next, I contacted a high-end exotic car rental agency. I handed over a massive cash deposit and drove away in a sleek midnight blue Aston Martin. Bradley and Cynthia worshipped appearances. They bowed down to the illusion of extreme wealth. If I was going to infiltrate their sanctuary, I had to wear their armor. I had to look like a man who belonged in their world. Agent Shaw handled the highly secure logistics on his end. He used his federal resources to seamlessly insert my pseudonym onto the VIP guest list for the gala. He listed me as a private wealth manager representing an anonymous European real estate syndicate. Bradley's ego was so massive and his greed was so blinding that he would never question a sudden wealthy addition to his audience. He wanted as many rich eyes on him as possible while he secured his fraudulent crown. Saturday night finally arrived. The relentless rain had cleared, leaving the city air sharp and freezing. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my penthouse suite. The bespoke black tuxedo fit me like a second skin. The dark fabric highlighted the broad shoulders I had built from years of lifting heavy stretchers and saving lives. I slipped the original notarized land deeds into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. I placed the brass vault key in my other pocket. I walked out to the elevator, rode it down to the pristine lobby, and stepped outside into the cold night. I slid into the driver's seat of the Aston Martin. The engine roared with a deep, powerful elegance. As I drove toward the massive, brilliantly lit event hall in the center of downtown Chicago, I felt absolutely no fear. I thought about Caroline bragging on my voicemail about standing in the presence of real wealth. I thought about Cynthia hiding behind her designer sunglasses while she literally poisoned my father in his own bed. And I thought about Bradley laughing at me in the boardroom, completely unaware that he was building his entire empire on quicksand. They had taken my career. They had taken my home. They had tried to take my freedom and put me in a federal prison, but tonight I was taking everything else. I pulled up to the red-carpeted entrance of the massive gala. The valet rushed forward immediately to open my door, his eyes wide at the sight of the exotic car. I stepped out into the flashing lights of the local press and the wealthy elite. I adjusted my cuffs and walked past the armed security guards at the front doors. They checked my pseudonym on the VIP list, nodded respectfully, and waved me through. I was no longer Harrison, the broken paramedic. I was the executioner, and the execution was about to begin. The deep resonating growl of the Aston Martin engine echoed off the slick rain-washed pavement of downtown Chicago. The relentless freezing storm had finally broken, leaving the night air feeling sharp and incredibly cold. The massive historic event hall loomed ahead of me, its grand stone columns bathed in blinding white spotlights. A long, pristine red carpet stretched from the heavy oak entrance doors all the way down to the curb. A line of black luxury vehicles, imported sports cars, and stretched limousines crawled slowly toward the valet stand. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my rented car. My hands were completely steady. I was no longer the exhausted, shivering paramedic who had been kicked out of his own house and framed for a federal crime. I was a man who held $20 million in clean, untraceable power, and I carried the absolute destruction of my enemies right inside the breast pocket of my bespoke tuxedo. I pulled the Aston Martin up to the valet stand. A young attendant in a crisp uniform rushed forward and opened my door. I stepped out onto the red carpet, handing him a crisp $100 bill along with the key fob. He thanked me profusely, his eyes wide with respect. It was amazing how quickly the world changed its posture when you wrapped yourself in the illusion of extreme wealth. Just 2 days ago, I was invisible. Tonight, I was treated like royalty simply because of the car I drove and the cut of my dark jacket. I adjusted my cuffs and walked up the wide stone steps toward the entrance. A team of heavily armed private security contractors stood at the heavy oak doors holding digital tablets and checking the guest list. These were Bradley's men. They were highly paid, highly trained, and completely loyal to the corporate payroll. I felt a brief, tiny spike of adrenaline in my chest as I approached them, but I forced my face into a mask of total bored indifference. I gave them the corporate pseudonym Agent Shaw had seamlessly inserted into their system. The head of security swiped his finger across the tablet, found the fake European real estate syndicate I was supposedly representing, and gave me a respectful nod. He stepped aside and the heavy oak doors swung open. I walked into a world of absolute blinding corruption. The grand ballroom was a massive cavern of gold leaf ceilings, towering crystal chandeliers, and highly polished marble floors. A string quartet played classical music softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the criminal networking happening all around them. Waiters in pristine white uniforms glided effortlessly through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The air was thick with the scent of high-end perfume, expensive cologne, and the low, arrogant hum of the city elite congratulating themselves on their own success. I stood near the entrance for a long moment, taking in the sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the room. These were the prominent politicians, the massive real estate moguls, and the wealthy socialites of Chicago. They were all gathered here under the guise of a charitable corporate groundbreaking ceremony. They believed they were celebrating the future of the city skyline. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were serving as the perfect legitimate cover for a massive international cartel money laundering operation. Bradley had brought them all here to provide a smokescreen of respectability while he officially signed away the city to violent criminals. I slowly began to weave my way through the dense crowd. Nobody looked at me twice. In this environment, an expensive suit and a confident, silent stride made you completely invisible. I was just another wealthy investor, another nameless face in the sea of corporate power. I kept my posture relaxed, moving toward the grand staircase near the center of the room while my eyes systematically scanned the faces of the guests. It only took me 3 minutes to find her. Caroline was standing near a massive, towering ice sculpture at the far end of the room, laughing loudly at something a much older man was saying. I stopped behind the cover of a large marble pillar and just watched my ex-wife. She was wearing a stunning, backless emerald green gown that I knew for an absolute fact she could not afford. Around her neck sat a heavy, intricate diamond necklace that caught the light of the chandeliers with every movement she made. She had her arm wrapped tightly around the elbow of a local commercial developer, a man notoriously known for his sleazy business practices and his inherited family wealth. She was looking up at him with the exact same expression of manufactured adoration and wide-eyed wonder she used to give me when we first met a decade ago. The sight of her standing there draped in stolen luxury did not break my heart. It did not make me angry. It just filled me with a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. She had secretly racked up $40,000 in credit card debt just to buy the clothes required to infiltrate this world. She had thrown away 10 years of loyal marriage, she had abandoned our vows, and she had destroyed the quiet, stable life we built for our children, all for the temporary illusion of standing in a ballroom like this. She was so blinded by her desperate greed that she could not even see the massive federal trap that was actively closing in around her. I turned my head and walked away, completely erasing her from my heart. I shifted my attention toward the front of the ballroom, scanning the area near the massive elevated stage. Cynthia was exactly where I expected her to be. My stepmother was holding court with the mayor and two prominent city councilmen. She wore a sleek silver designer gown that made her look like liquid metal. She was smiling with a predatory, calculating satisfaction. She looked completely and utterly victorious. She thought she had successfully poisoned my father to death without leaving a single trace. She thought she had stolen his entire empire and eradicated me from the family tree with absolute perfection. I watched the way she casually sipped her champagne, acting the part of the grieving but strong corporate widow, while quietly orchestrating the largest financial crime in the history of the Midwest. My blood burned hot in my veins at the sight of her, remembering the breathless terror in my father's voice on the tape, but I kept my face entirely neutral. The time for anger had passed. Tonight was strictly about execution. I continued moving closer to the stage, blending into a group of wealthy corporate bankers who were loudly discussing offshore interest rates. As I navigated the floor, I began to notice the subtle tactical anomalies hidden within the wealthy crowd. Agent Shaw had promised me he would have his federal task force in position, and he had absolutely delivered. Standing near the heavy emergency exit doors, disguised as regular event security personnel, were men with sharp, constantly assessing eyes and small earpieces hidden carefully beneath their shirt collars. Hovering near the busy open bar, pretending to casually sip glasses of sparkling water, were two plainclothes FBI agents in dark suits, their stances rigid and completely alert. I made brief, fleeting eye contact with a federal agent stationed near the right side of the stage stairs. He gave me a barely perceptible nod before looking away. The perimeter was entirely locked down. The trap was perfectly set. No one was leaving this ballroom tonight. I shifted my gaze to the front row of reserved VIP tables situated directly beneath the center of the stage. Sitting there, looking entirely out of place despite their expensive dark tailoring, were four men with cold, dead eyes. They were not smiling. They were not drinking the free champagne. They were not talking to the local politicians. They were watching the stage with the intense, silent scrutiny of apex predators. These were the international cartel investors. These were the men who had brought tens of millions of dollars in dirty offshore cash into this room. They were waiting for Bradley to officially sign the downtown development contracts so they could finalize the massive corporate wire transfers on their secure digital tablets. Bradley was playing a highly dangerous game with highly dangerous men, and he believed his immense arrogance would protect him from the consequences. Suddenly, a loud, dramatic chord of classical music echoed through the ballroom sound system, signaling the wealthy crowd to quiet down and take their seats. The low, arrogant hum of conversation faded rapidly into an expectant silence. The bright overhead spotlights shifted, converging entirely on the center of the massive stage. Bradley walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. He looked like the absolute picture of young corporate royalty. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that fit his athletic frame flawlessly. His hair was slicked back and his teeth shone in a bright, highly manufactured smile. He walked confidently to the clear acrylic podium, basking in the loud, enthusiastic applause of the corrupt politicians, the greedy developers, and the clueless socialites. He raised his hands smoothly, gesturing for the massive crowd to settle down. "Thank you," Bradley projected into the microphone, his voice dripping with false humility and practiced charm. "Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are here to celebrate the future of the Chicago skyline. But before we look forward to the new development, I want to take a moment to honor the past. I want to honor my father." The sheer terrifying hypocrisy of his words sent a cold, sharp shiver down my spine. Bradley looked out over the massive crowd, placing a hand reverently over his heart. "My father built sterling commercial real estate with his bare hands." Bradley continued, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. He taught me that true power is not just about building massive structures of steel and glass. It is about building a lasting legacy. He wanted this company to reach the absolute summit of international success. He wanted to change the world. And tonight, with the official signing of this $300 million downtown development initiative, I am finally fulfilling his dying wish. I am taking his empire into a new global era. The ballroom erupted into another round of deafening, enthusiastic applause. I stood absolutely still near the back of the center aisle, listening to the wealthy elites clap and cheer for a man who was actively selling out his own city to a violent cartel. The contrast between my reality and their illusion was physically nauseating. I had spent my entire adult life in the back of a speeding ambulance watching good, honest people struggle to pay for basic medical care, watching families break apart under the weight of genuine tragedy. And here was Bradley, a man who had literally poisoned his own father to death in his own bed, being applauded as a visionary corporate leader by the highest members of society. It was a perfectly constructed illusion of prestige, built entirely on blood theft and deceit. I watched Cynthia wipe a completely fake tear from her eye as the crowd clapped around her. She played her part with terrifying sociopathic perfection. I glanced over and saw Caroline clapping too. She was looking up at Bradley with absolute awe, completely intoxicated by the blinding display of extreme wealth and power. She had traded her integrity for the chance to stand in a room exactly like this. On the stage, a beautifully polished mahogany desk was rolled out from the shadows by 2 event staff members. Resting squarely in the center of the desk was a massive, thick, leather-bound contract. It was the official downtown development agreement. It was the ultimate legal document that would officially sign away the rights to the city properties and authorize the massive influx of cartel money into the sterling corporate accounts. Once Bradley's pen hit that paper, the federal wire fraud would be absolute, documented, and entirely undeniable. Agent Shaw needed that contract signed. He needed the cartel investors sitting in the front row to initiate the digital money transfers on their tablets. And then he needed me to step out and detonate the entire criminal operation in front of every single camera in the room. Bradley stepped gracefully away from the acrylic podium and walked slowly toward the mahogany desk. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a practiced, elegant motion, ensuring the press photographers got the perfect angle of his tailored silhouette. He picked up a heavy, solid gold fountain pen that had been carefully placed next to the leather binder. He looked out at the front row of tables, giving a firm, highly confident nod to the 4 cartel investors sitting in the shadows. I watched closely as one of the quiet, dangerous men in the front row reached inside his dark suit jacket, pulled out a highly encrypted digital tablet, and prepared to authorize the massive offshore wire transfers. The timing of this execution had to be absolutely flawless. The massive ballroom was completely silent now. The anticipation hung incredibly heavy in the air. The local press photographers raised their expensive cameras, their fingers hovering nervously over the shutters, waiting to capture the historic corporate moment. Bradley looked out over the sea of faces, soaking in the admiration, soaking in the absolute power. He truly believed he had won everything. He believed he had successfully crushed his older brother, outsmarted the federal government, and secured an untouchable criminal throne that would last for decades. He leaned over the mahogany desk. He positioned the tip of the gold pen directly above the signature line of the massive contract. I took a long, deep breath. I felt the heavy brass vault key and the crisp, notarized land deeds resting safely inside my jacket, right against my chest. I stepped out from the quiet shadows of the wealthy crowd. I walked directly into the center aisle. The grand ballroom of the event center was a sea of blinding chandeliers, clinking crystal glasses, and the low, arrogant hum of the city elite. I stood in the deep shadows near the back entrance, wearing a custom-tailored black tuxedo that cost more than I used to make in a month riding in the back of an ambulance. Inside the breast pocket of my jacket, pressing heavily against my chest, were the original notarized land deeds to the entire downtown commercial district, alongside the photocopies of my father's secret financial ledger. I watched from the darkness as Bradley stood on the brightly lit stage. He was gripping a solid gold fountain pen, hovering it just an inch above the massive leather-bound development contract resting on the mahogany podium. He was smiling out at the crowd, soaking in their absolute adoration. In the front row, the four silent men representing the international cartel were holding their encrypted digital tablets, ready to authorize the transfer of tens of millions of dollars in dirty offshore cash, the exact second Bradley's pen touched the paper. This was the moment. This was the absolute peak of Bradley's stolen empire. He was one signature away from cementing a massive criminal conspiracy and completely wiping my existence off the map. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, conditioned air of the ballroom fill my lungs. My pulse was completely steady. The paralyzing fear, the exhausting panic, and the deep, suffocating grief that had consumed me over the last 48 hours had entirely vanished. I stepped out from the shadows and began walking straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. My dark leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. The sound was rhythmic, steady, and incredibly loud in the cavernous room. At first, no one noticed me. The wealthy socialites and corrupt politicians were entirely focused on the stage, waiting for the historic corporate signing to conclude. But as I moved further down the center aisle, passing the massive ice sculptures and the elegantly dressed guests, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. The people standing nearest to me stopped talking. They turned their heads, their expressions shifting from polite interest to deep confusion. The sudden silence began to ripple outward from my position, spreading across the massive ballroom like a heavy, invisible wave. One by one, the guests stopped clapping. The low hum of conversation faded into nothing. Even the string quartet playing softly in the corner of the room seemed to lose their rhythm, the music dying away into a scattered, discordant halt. By the time I reached the halfway point of the aisle, the entire ballroom was dead silent. Hundreds of eyes were locked directly on me. Bradley noticed the sudden change in the crowd. He paused, his hand still hovering over the contract, and looked out into the center aisle. For a fraction of a second, his eyes swept over me without a single spark of recognition. I was cleanly shaven. I was standing tall. I was wearing a bespoke suit that fit my broad shoulders perfectly. I did not look like the exhausted, broken paramedic he had humiliated in the boardroom just 2 days ago. But then, as the bright stage spotlights caught my face, the realization hit him. Bradley's perfect manufactured smile faltered. His eyes widened and a flash of pure, genuine shock crossed his features. But Bradley had spent his entire life playing a role. He recovered his composure almost instantly, relying on the immense, blinding arrogance that had always protected him. He leaned forward, bringing his mouth close to the microphone attached to the acrylic podium. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for the interruption," Bradley projected into the microphone. His voice was loud, smooth, and absolutely dripping with condescension. It echoed off the high gold leaf ceilings. "It looks like my older brother somehow found a discarded suit in a downtown dumpster and wandered into the wrong building." A ripple of nervous, highly uncomfortable laughter washed through the crowd. I did not break my stride. I kept my eyes locked entirely on him, my expression completely blank. I walked past the tables of local politicians. I walked past the wealthy developers. "Security," Bradley commanded into the microphone, his tone shifting from mocking amusement to sharp corporate authority. "Please escort the EMT out of the building before he tracks mud onto the carpets. He is clearly lost and highly confused." 4 large men wearing dark suits and earpieces instantly stepped out from the edges of the seating area, moving to intercept me before I could reach the front row. I saw Bradley smirk, confident that his highly paid private contractors would drag me out the back doors and beat me into a bloody pulp in the alleyway. But Bradley did not know that the men in those dark suits did not work for him. Agent Shaw had completely replaced Bradley's private security team with undercover federal agents 2 hours before the gala even began. As the 4 men converged on my position in the center aisle, they did not grab my arms. They did not push me backward. Instead, they simply stopped, turned their bodies outward to face the crowd, and clasped their hands in front of them, creating a clear, protected path directly to the stage. Bradley's smirk vanished instantly, his brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. He looked at the security guards, opening his mouth to yell another command, but the words completely died in his throat. He looked back at me, and for the very first time in his entire life, I saw a genuine flicker of fear in his eyes. He realized he was no longer in control of the room. I reached the front row. I walked directly past the table where the 4 cartel investors were sitting. They were no longer relaxed. Their cold, dead eyes were darting around the room, assessing the sudden lack of security response. They recognized a trap when they saw one. One of the men slowly lowered his hand beneath the table, reaching for a weapon. But the federal agent, disguised as a waiter standing directly behind him, subtly placed a firm hand on his shoulder, shaking his head once. The cartel man froze. I climbed the 5 carpeted steps leading up to the massive, brightly lit stage. The heat from the overhead spotlights washed over me. I walked straight across the wooden floor, closing the distance between me and the man who had stolen my father's empire. "Harry, what the hell do you think you are doing?" Bradley hissed under his breath, leaning away from the microphone so the crowd could not hear his rising panic. "You are actively destroying a $300 million deal. Get off this stage right now, or I swear to God I will have you buried under a federal prison for the rest of your pathetic life. I own the police in this city. You are nothing." I did not yell. I did not throw a punch. I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. I reached inside my tailored jacket and pulled out the thick, heavy red folder containing the true, untainted legacy of the Sterling estate. I stepped directly up to the mahogany desk. Bradley tried to block the desk with his body, but I simply pushed his shoulder aside with a firm, effortless shove. I dropped the heavy red folder directly on top of the open development contract. The thick stack of paper hit the wood with a loud, definitive slap that echoed through the microphone and out into the silent ballroom. "You cannot sign away the development rights, Bradley," I said. I kept my voice entirely calm, but I spoke loudly and clearly enough that the microphone picked up every single syllable. The words boomed across the vast, glittering room. "Because you do not own the land. I do, and the FBI is extremely interested in the offshore account numbers you just logged into." The entire ballroom collectively gasped. The sound of hundreds of people drawing in a sharp, shocked breath was absolutely deafening. Bradley stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked down at the red folder resting on top of his fraudulent contract. His hands began to tremble violently. He reached out and flipped open the heavy red cover. Resting right on top of the stack was a highly magnified full-color photocopy of the final page of my father's secret ledger. It clearly showed Bradley's signature directly validating a massive illegal wire transfer to a known cartel shell company. Right beneath the ledger copy were the original fully notarized, state-certified land deeds to the entire downtown commercial district. The deeds explicitly listed my name, Harrison, as the sole irrevocable owner of the exact dirt Bradley was currently standing on. Bradley's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the chest and was waiting for the pain to arrive. He looked from the documents back up to my face and then down at the papers again. His perfect, slick corporate facade shattered into a million tiny pieces, where Bradley stammered, his voice cracking completely, forgetting about the microphone amplifying his absolute terror. "Where did you get these? This is impossible. We audited everything. We searched every corporate account." I leaned forward, resting both of my hands firmly on the edge of the mahogany desk, invading his space, and forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "I found them exactly where Dad left them for me," I whispered, keeping my voice low so only he could hear the true depth of his failure. "I found them inside the rusted-out glove box of a 1993 Chevy Silverado, the same piece of garbage you practically begged me to crush in a scrapyard. You handed me the weapon that destroys your entire life, Bradley. You handed it to me because you thought I was too weak to open it." The realization hit him with a devastating physical force. I watched his knees actually buckle slightly. He stumbled backward away from the podium, dropping the solid gold fountain pen. It clattered loudly onto the wooden stage and rolled off the edge, falling into the shadows below. Bradley suddenly understood the absolute inescapable finality of his situation. He had spent the last 2 days celebrating his victory completely unaware that he had personally handed the ultimate corporate kill switch to a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He had triggered his own execution. Before Bradley could even attempt to formulate an excuse, the heavy emergency exit doors at the back and sides of the massive ballroom were violently thrown open. Federal agents in full tactical gear wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs flooded into the room. The elegant high society silence was instantly shattered by the loud commanding shouts of federal law enforcement. "Nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them. This entire building is under federal lockdown." The ballroom descended into absolute terrified chaos. Wealthy socialites screamed and ducked behind their linen-covered tables. Prominent politicians, men who had spent their entire careers avoiding scandals, scrambled backward, knocking over expensive crystal centerpieces in a desperate, pathetic attempt to distance themselves from the stage. In the front row, the 4 cartel investors realized exactly what was happening. They realized Bradley had not just failed to secure the land rights. He had marched them directly into the center of a massive, heavily coordinated federal ambush. The investor holding the digital tablet raised it high, preparing to smash the encrypted device against the edge of the table to destroy the routing data. But the undercover agent standing behind him moved with lightning speed. The agent grabbed the investor's wrist, twisting it violently backward, and drove the man face first into the white linen tablecloth, securing the unencrypted tablet instantly. The other 3 cartel members were tackled to the floor by surrounding agents before they could even draw their concealed weapons. From my position on the elevated stage, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I looked past the screaming crowd and saw my stepmother, Cynthia. Cynthia was no longer smiling. Her sleek, predatory confidence had completely evaporated. She was standing near the mayor's table, clutching a small designer purse tightly against her chest. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes wide with animalistic panic. She saw the federal agents swarming the floor. She saw the cartel investors being handcuffed. She looked up at the stage and locked eyes with me. In that brief, silent exchange, she knew her entire sociopathic game was over. She knew I had found the tape. She knew I had heard my father's dying words. Cynthia turned sharply, abandoning her glass of champagne, and broke into a desperate, undignified run toward the side exit doors leading to the catering kitchen. She shoved a terrified waiter out of her path, her silver designer gown catching the light as she sprinted toward the shadows. But she did not even make it 5 steps. 2 heavily armed United States Marshals stepped out from the kitchen corridor, completely blocking her path. Cynthia hit the brakes, her high heels skidding on the polished marble floor. She tried to turn around, looking for another escape route, but the marshals moved in instantly. They grabbed her arms, spinning her violently around and pinning her face first against a massive decorative marble pillar. I watched in absolute satisfying silence as the cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around her wrists. The woman who had meticulously poisoned my father, the woman who had stolen his empire and tried to leave me with absolutely nothing, was reduced to a crying, humiliated criminal being marched out the service exit in front of the entire Chicago elite. On the stage, Bradley was hyperventilating. He was backed into the heavy velvet curtains, his hands clutching his own hair, completely incapable of processing the speed of his destruction. 2 FBI agents sprinted up the stage stairs, their weapons holstered but their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Bradley Vance, the lead agent, announced loudly, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and suspicion of homicide. Put your hands behind your back." Bradley did not fight them. All the fight had completely drained out of him. He slowly lowered his trembling hands and let the agent secure the steel cuffs around his wrists. As they turned him around to march him off the stage, Bradley looked at me. There was no arrogance left. There was no superiority. There was only the broken, terrified expression of a man who realized he was going to spend the rest of his life locked inside a concrete cell. He opened his mouth to say something, but the agents shoved him forward, marching him down the stairs and into the chaotic sea of federal uniforms. I remained standing at the mahogany podium. The bright stage lights were still beating down on me, illuminating the sharp lines of my bespoke suit. I slowly picked up the red folder containing my family's true legacy and secured it safely inside my jacket. I looked down at the ballroom floor, scanning the terrified crowd as the agents methodically cleared the room. And then, standing near the shattered remains of a massive ice sculpture, I saw her, Caroline. My ex-wife was standing completely frozen in her stunning emerald green gown. The local commercial developer she had been clinging to all night was gone. He had literally dropped his drink and ran toward the back exit the moment the federal agents announced the raid, abandoning her completely in his desperate rush to avoid arrest. Caroline was entirely alone. She was staring up at the stage. She was looking directly at me. Her face was a portrait of absolute devastating horror. She had mocked my paramedic uniform. She had called me a financially pathetic loser. She had secretly racked up $40,000 in debt and drained our life savings because she was absolutely certain I was a weak, forgotten man who would never amount to anything. She had completely thrown me away to chase the illusion of extreme wealth. And now she was standing in the middle of a federal raid, watching the men she admired being hauled away in handcuffs. And she was watching the husband she had viciously discarded stand at the very center of the room, completely untouched, utterly powerful, and in absolute legal control of a $20 million empire. I could see the exact moment the agonizing truth clicked in her mind. I could see her realize that she had traded a man who loved her for a sinking ship. She had betrayed the actual rightful king of the Sterling estate. She raised a trembling hand to her mouth, tears of profound soul-crushing regret welling up in her eyes. She took a hesitant step toward the stage, her lips silently forming my name. I did not smile. I did not glare at her. I simply looked at her with the cold, detached pity you reserve for a stranger you pass on the street. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the credit union vault, and held it tightly in my fist. Then I turned my back on her entirely. I walked off the side of the stage, disappearing into the shadows, leaving her to stand alone in the wreckage of the world she had chosen. 6 months have passed since the night the Federal Bureau of Investigation stormed the grand ballroom and shattered the illusion of my family. The fall of sterling commercial real estate was swift, absolutely brutal, and entirely public. The federal government did not just arrest my stepbrother Bradley and my stepmother Cynthia. They systematically dismantled every single piece of the lives they had built on the blood of my father. The detailed leather ledger I pulled from the rusted dashboard of the old Chevy truck gave the Justice Department a complete, undeniable roadmap to the entire criminal empire. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus were frozen by international authorities and repatriated. The complex web of shell companies was entirely liquidated. The $300 million downtown construction project was seized by the federal government and eventually canceled by the City Planning Commission. Bradley and Cynthia were immediately denied bail. They spent the entire brutal Chicago winter sitting in maximum security, federal holding cells stripped of their custom suits and silver designer gowns. The media circus surrounding the trial was relentless. The local news stations covered every single detail of the corporate corruption, but the financial crimes were nothing compared to the murder charges. The federal prosecutors did not hold back a single ounce of mercy. They were both indicted on over 50 counts of international money laundering, corporate racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. During the trial, the absolute cowardice of my stepbrother was finally put on display for the entire world to see. Bradley immediately tried to turn on his own mother to secure a plea deal, claiming Cynthia was the sole mastermind behind the cartel connections and the poisoning. But the medical evidence corroborated my father's final recorded message perfectly. The exhumation and subsequent toxicology reports proved they had both been actively administering the untraceable toxins that simulated a massive cardiac arrest. Bradley was sentenced to 45 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Cynthia received a permanent life sentence. Their $4 million suburban estate was seized and auctioned off by the bank. Bradley's exotic cars were repossessed. Everything they built on greed, everything they stole from my father turned to dust the moment the absolute truth was dragged into the light. As for me, the false internal affairs allegations regarding the medical fentanyl theft were immediately dismissed. The investigation was formally closed the morning after the gala raid, the moment the FBI confirmed Bradley had fabricated the digital paper trail to destroy my credibility. Captain Miller called me personally to apologize. He asked me to come down to the precinct. When I walked through the double doors of the dispatch hall, the silence was gone, replaced by the deep respect of my peers. Captain Miller offered me my senior paramedic badge back, complete with 6 months of retroactive back pay and a formal letter of exoneration from the state medical board. I accepted his apology, and I proudly pinned my badge back onto my chest, but my life had entirely changed. I no longer needed to scramble for weekend overtime shifts just to survive. I no longer had to sleep in a freezing truck cab or worry about how I was going to afford my next meal. The $20 million in clean, untraceable bearer bonds and precious metals my father had legally separated from the corrupt firm were entirely mine. The original land deeds were cleared by a federal judge, cementing my legal ownership of the prime commercial real estate in the financial district. But I did not use the massive wealth to buy a gaudy mansion or a fleet of sports cars. I remembered the grueling 14-hour shifts. I remembered the desperate families I treated on the violent streets of the city who could not afford basic medical care. I used a massive portion of my father's clean inheritance to establish the Richard Sterling Community Medical Foundation. I funded free mobile health clinics for the absolute poorest neighborhoods in Chicago. I purchased a fleet of brand new, fully equipped advanced life support ambulances for my old precinct. I still ride in the back of those ambulances 2 days a week. I do not do it for the hourly paycheck anymore. I do it because saving lives is exactly who I am. It is the honorable working-class life my father deeply respected, the life he sacrificed his own safety to protect from the cartel. I thought the darkness of the past was finally behind me until a rainy Tuesday afternoon just last week. I was sitting at a quiet corner table in a small independent downtown coffee shop reviewing a multi-million-dollar grant proposal for the medical foundation. The brass bell above the front door chimed. I looked up from my paperwork and saw Caroline walking into the cafe. She looked completely different from the arrogant woman who had stood in the center of that glittering ballroom dripping in stolen diamonds. Her expensive designer clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap wrinkled trench coat and scuffed boots. She looked exhausted, pale, and deeply defeated. The slick commercial developer she had tried to replace me with had abandoned her the exact moment the federal raid began, completely terrified of being associated with a cartel investigation. Furthermore, because Caroline had actively participated in attempting to steal our marital assets and had knowingly drained our joint savings accounts during a pending separation, the divorce court judge had shown her absolutely zero mercy. She had walked away from our 10-year marriage with nothing. No alimony, no house, and shared custody of our children entirely on my terms. She spotted me sitting in the corner and immediately rushed over. She pulled out the wooden chair across from me and sat down without asking permission. Her hands were shaking violently as she placed them on the table. "Harrison," she said, her voice trembling and thick with unshed tears. "You look so good." I slowly closed the grant proposal folder and looked directly at her. I did not feel any lingering anger. I did not feel any sorrow or heartbreak. I felt absolutely nothing. "What do you want, Caroline?" I asked calmly, keeping my voice completely level. She reached out across the table trying to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled it back and rested it on my lap. She let out a sharp, pathetic sob. "I made a terrible mistake, Harrison," she cried, tears streaming down her face and ruining her minimal makeup. I was completely terrified. Cynthia got into my head. She texted me that day and told me you were going to drag our family into absolute poverty. She manipulated me into draining the bank accounts. She told me I had to protect myself and the children from your financial incompetence. I was scared and I was foolish, and I am so incredibly sorry. I miss you. The kids miss having us all together under one roof. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can be a real family again." I stared at her as she wept openly in the middle of the coffee shop. I thought back to the night she locked me out in the freezing rain. I thought about the absolute cruelty in her eyes when she called me a financially pathetic loser. I remembered how quickly she had packed my faded duffel bag. She was not crying right now because she loved me. She was crying because she realized she had bet on the wrong horse. She had thrown away a loyal, hard-working man for a mirage of immense wealth, and now that the wealth was completely and legally mine, she wanted to claw her way back to the summit. She did not want the man who drove the ambulance. She wanted the man who controlled the $20 million foundation. "Cynthia did not manipulate you, Caroline," I said. My voice was low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Cynthia just gave you the exact excuse you were desperately looking for. You hated our life. You hated my job. You were perfectly willing to destroy my reputation. Frame me for abandonment and leave me homeless on the street just to get closer to the money you thought Bradley possessed." "Harrison, please," she begged, her voice rising in sheer desperation as a few people in the cafe started to look over at our table. "I am the mother of your children. You cannot just leave me with absolutely nothing. I have nothing left. You made your choice the night you packed my bags and laughed at my inheritance," I replied, standing up slowly from the table. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I placed it gently on the table right next to her trembling, empty hands. "Buy yourself a coffee, Caroline." She looked down at the $20 bill and then looked back up at me, her face twisting in pure, devastating agony as the reality of my absolute rejection finally set in. "You chose the illusion," I told her, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a closing vault door. I kept the truth. I turned around and walked toward the exit. I heard her sob my name one last time, a pathetic, desperate sound that faded instantly as I pushed open the glass door and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I did not look back, not once. I walked down the street to the private parking garage and approached my vehicle. It was not a rented exotic sports car. It was not a chauffeur-driven corporate limousine. It was a 1993 Chevy Silverado. I had used a tiny fraction of my new wealth to have the old truck completely and meticulously restored from the ground up. Every single trace of rust was gone, replaced by a flawless, shining coat of deep metallic blue paint. The engine was completely rebuilt, purring with a smooth, powerful perfection that echoed in the concrete garage. The shattered driver's side window had been replaced, and the interior was fitted with brand new, incredibly comfortable leather seats. And the dashboard Glovebox had been perfectly repaired, sealing away the empty space where the darkest, deadliest secret of my family had been hidden for years. I unlocked the heavy door, climbed up into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition key. The massive V8 engine roared to life, strong, warm, and entirely reliable. As I drove out of the garage and navigated through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, passing the towering glass high-rises that my family used to control, I felt a deep, abiding sense of absolute peace. My father had made terrible, catastrophic mistakes in his pursuit of corporate power, but in the very end he had found a way to make things right. He had trusted the son he ignored, and he had laid a flawless, lethal trap for the son he elevated. Bradley and Cynthia thought they had outsmarted the entire world. They thought winning meant taking the most pieces off the board by any means necessary. They thought they could lie, steal, and murder their way to the absolute top of the city skyline. But they learned the hardest lesson of all. Real power is not about how much stolen money you can hoard in a corrupt offshore bank account. Real power is knowing which pieces actually matter. Real power is having the profound courage to stand completely alone in a freezing parking lot with nothing but a rusted set of keys and choosing to fight for the truth anyway. My family laughed at me for holding on to the past. They mocked me for keeping an old truck. But the past was the very thing that destroyed them, and it was the very thing that finally set me free. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment below about a time someone underestimated you and you proved them entirely wrong. Share this video with anyone who needs a firm reminder that the loudest, most arrogant people in the room are usually the weakest, and that true strength is built quietly in the shadows. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about family secrets, hidden truths, and the unexpected ways karma finally catches up to the people who deserve it most. Thanks for listening, and always remember that sometimes the absolute greatest treasures are hidden inside the exact things everyone else throws away.